This periodic aspect should always be watched for in the case of women, in whom any temperamental instability becomes greatly exaggerated during the times of the monthly periods, at the change of life, during pregnancy, and, in fact, at any period when the sex life is stirred to activity, whether emotionally or physically. It is also well to bear in mind that in pathological cases the periodicity of a woman's function may be greatly disturbed. I had a sharp lesson in this respect upon one occasion, which exemplifies the need of caution. We had, at the introduction of one of our members, received into one of our community houses a woman whose husband, a well-known man in public life, refused to live with her, so I was told, and had made several attempts to do away with her, and threatened to have her certified insane if she in any way resisted him. These facts were vouched for by a circle of friends to whom both husband and wife were known. I kept this lady under observation for a month in order to see whether there was anything to justify the charge of insanity, and seeing nothing, took up her case. At the 7th week, however, trouble ensued. She got into a great state of excitement, declared that she was being starved, and ill-treated by the person who, in my absence, was responsible for the house. 7 weeks later we had another bout, in which she said that evil influences were proceeding from a certain cupboard in her room, wandered about the house in exceedingly inadequate apparel, and lost all self-control. This attack also passed off in a few days. It came out in the end that she suffered from chronic appendicitis which involved the right ovary, and whenever her exceedingly irregular menstruation occurred, she went right off her head for a few days. The position was greatly complicated by the fact that in the interregnum she was to all outward appearances perfectly sane. After she left our community house she told exactly the same stories about us that she had previously been telling about her husband. The out-and-out lunatic is a much less serious problem to society than these borderline cases. They need dealing with extremely cautiously, for they can cause an immense amount of trouble. When an insanity has once become well developed, anyone who has had experience of lunatics has little difficulty in recognizing it. Each type of insanity has its characteristic facial expression and even gait. But it is not so simple a matter for even the expert to recognize an insanity in its incipient stages. Lunatics are exceedingly plausible, and if they have picked up something of the jargon of the occultist or spiritualist, can make out an extraordinarily good case for themselves. Even the experienced alienist often has to keep a case under observation in order to ascertain whether it is an actual insanity or not. In a field where experts are frequently in doubt, what is the layman to do who finds himself confronted by a case which rouses his suspicions? He cannot be expected to recognize insanity when he sees it, but his own common sense ought to be sufficient to enable him to recognize sanity. In other words, let him suspend judgment upon the alleged facts and concentrate upon the question of motive. It is here he will find his best indication. If a person can offer no valid explanation as to the reasons for the attack that is being made upon him, nor as to its cause or origin, we can probably rest assured that it originates in his own imagination. In one case which came into my hands for help, the victim declared that he was being persecuted by telepathic suggestion. I inquired as to the origin of this persecution, and he said that some people who lived in the next flat used to sit in a circle and concentrate upon him. I asked him why they did this. He did not know. I asked him how he knew they did it, and he could not tell me. He merely reiterated that they did it, although he admitted that he had never been inside their flat, never, in fact, even spoken to them except to exchange a good morning on the stairs. It was immediately apparent that there was no conceivable motive that could cause these people to go to the trouble of persecuting him. If anyone has ever tried any experiments with telepathic suggestion, they will know what intense concentration it requires, and, in fact, what hard work it is. And one cannot possibly imagine anybody putting themselves to the trouble of doing it over long periods of time without a very definite motive. I have, however, heard of a well-authenticated case of a woman who had a liaison with a married man attacking his wife in this way. I have also myself known of 2 cases in which a certain individual, at one time prominent in transcendental circles, in connection with what the newspapers impolitely called his prayer shop, And equally well known in the city in connection with his efforts to obtain gold from seawater, used telepathic suggestion in order to induce the signing of checks and documents. Before a visitor was expected for an interview, he would sit down and concentrate upon him. So strong was the influence thus exerted that a man of my acquaintance threw up a post he held under him because of the undue mental influence he felt was being exerted over himself. And another resigned off the board of one of his companies for the same reason. In both these cases an adequate motive for the mental attack is not far to seek. Compare these two cases with the previous one, and the difference can readily be perceived. We should, however, be just as cautious in deciding there is nothing wrong as in accepting at their face value any statements that may be made to us. Moreover, we should always bear in mind when dealing with a person who is obviously mentally unbalanced and who alleges a psychic attack, that the mental unbalance may have been induced by the psychic attack. Life is a strange thing at best, and many things that are stranger than usual can happen to those who move in occult circles. Chapter 10. Non-occult dangers of the Black Lodge. The facts considered in the previous chapter, though they should make us exceedingly careful in weighing evidence, must not blind us to the fact that there are black sheep in every fold and that a fraternity which started out with the best of intentions may quite inadvertently, through the ignorance or imperfections of its leaders, begin to drift on to the left-hand path. Perfectly innocent people enter it when it is in process of drifting but not yet avowedly black, and may find themselves in waters that are unpleasantly dirty, even if not actually dangerous. The esoteric dangers will be studied in detail in the next chapter, but we may very well consider in this place the exoteric dangers which may occur behind the veil of the temple, for human nature is much the same wherever we meet it, and shows little originality in choosing its road to the pit. It might be thought that in such a book as this there were no need to touch upon these matters, but if this book is to serve the purpose for which it is intended, it is necessary to do so for three reasons. Firstly, because the greater proportion of the students of esotericism are women, and even in these enlightened days they are usually ignorant of the life of the underworld. And a Black Lodge leads by a straight and narrow way into the land of Apaches and demimondanes, quite apart from its other drawbacks. Secondly, a knowledge of these facts is essential for differential diagnosis. Thirdly, occult powers are not infrequently used to obtain purely mundane ends, therefore when the question of ordinary criminality occurs in connection with an occult organization, the issue may be complicated by an admixture of methods that belong to another plane. We must always remember that a lodge may not necessarily have been formed for the express purpose of evading the law. It may have started with a perfectly legitimate end in view, and have been exploited by evildoers for their own purposes, for, owing to the secretive nature of its proceedings, the fraternity form of organization lends itself to various forms of lawbreaking. One occult organization is well known to have been involved in the drug traffic, another is riddled with unnatural vice. A third degenerated into what was little better than a house of ill fame, and its head was an expert abortionist. Others have been involved in subversive politics. Those who join fraternities without properly investigating them and the credentials of those who are running them may find themselves involved in any or all of these things. Behind the veil of secrecy, guarded by impressive oaths, many things may happen, and it is therefore essential to inform oneself most carefully concerning the character, credentials and record of the leaders of an organization. If these are not readily accessible, something is wrong. The mysterious stranger, who has just arrived from the East or the continent, both rather vague addresses, is probably a fraud. If difficulty is experienced in discovering the antecedents of an alleged adept, inquiries could be made of the well-known periodical, Truth, of Carteret Street, SWI. Truth was originally founded to expose abuses in financial and public life, and for this purpose keeps a black list of individuals who are better avoided. It is fair and fearless in its methods, neither a persecutor nor a respecter of persons. It keeps a watchful eye upon the occult field and pillories charlatans, a task for which it should have the gratitude and support of all who have the cause of the wisdom religion at heart. The commonest danger to which a person who gets into the company of undesirables is exposed, is to be induced to part with more money than is convenient by the time-honored expedients of either swindling or blackmailing. The latter being by far the commonest form of unpleasantness in black lodges. The one and only remedy in all such cases is to place the matter in the hands of the police. Firstly, it is your duty as a citizen in order that others may not be victimized as you have been. Secondly, if you don't, your persecutors will not leave you until they have sucked you absolutely dry, and not even then if they can still find a use for you as a catspaw. A blackmailer is never got rid of by giving him money. It is merely an invitation to call again. Act quickly and firmly at the outset and you will soon be at the end of your troubles. To demand money with threats is blackmail, and to coerce to any course of action by threats is also a crime. Any arrangements entered into, or documents signed in consequence of threats are not binding. Threats need not necessarily be gross and open, such as the pointing of a revolver. Anything which coerces you against your inclinations may be interpreted as a threat. For instance, supposing it were intimated to you, however tactfully, that if you did not subscribe to the funds of an organization, your interest in occultism would be liable to be gossiped about, and possibly involve you in unpleasantness with your relatives, or your employers, this, in the eyes of the law, would be blackmail. Anything, in fact, which plays upon a person's fears is a threat. Let us now consider what is the best thing to do if you are being threatened. It is seldom wise to answer threat with threat. The best thing is to reply that you will think it over and see what can be done, and then go straight to the nearest police station and tell the whole story. You can be sure of the utmost courtesy and kindness, and that every effort will be made to help you, even if you have to admit that you have not been wholly blameless yourself. In coming to the police and telling them frankly the position of affairs you have, in popular language, turned king's evidence, and the authorities will go a long way to protect anyone who does this. Do not be deterred by the fact that you cannot bring forward any additional testimony in support of your statement. The police may tell you that there is not sufficient evidence for them to apply for a warrant. Nevertheless, they will make inquiries, and the very fact that the police are making inquiries will be sufficient to frighten blackmailers out of their wits and probably out of the country. Nor will they usually stop to make the threatened disclosures en route, but will go while the going is good. Moreover, your complaint will go on to the police records, and a watch will be kept. In due course another complaint may be made, or, for all you know, may already have been made, and then the net begins to tighten. Always remember that the blackmailer has a great deal more to fear from exposure than you have. For whatever unpleasantness may be in store for you, he has to look forward to a long term of penal servitude, and possibly the dreaded cat if the case is a bad one. A timely reminder of this fact works wonders with prospective blackmailers. Nor need the fear of exposure of your own shortcomings deter you. The nature of the charges brought against you by the blackmailer will never be mentioned. It is not you who are being tried. Neither will your identity be disclosed. You will be referred to as Mr. A or Mrs. B. Far from being treated as an evildoer or having the finger of scorn pointed at you, you will find that you are looked upon as a person who is performing a public service, and every effort will be made by those in authority to smooth your path. A determined effort is being made at the present time to stamp out this abominable crime, and judges are giving exemplary sentences and protecting prosecutors in every way in order to encourage them to come forward. But quite apart from any form of coercion, unwary persons may, while filled with enthusiasm or glamored by the new revelation, part with considerably more money than they can comfortably spare. They may even literally lay their all upon the altar, and then, disillusioned by subsequent events, greatly regret having done so. In many such cases a competent solicitor can secure a refund. The courts do not look with favor on excessive contributions to movements. It goes without saying that no rightly conducted organization would consent to augment its funds at the expense of the ruin of one of its members. It must, of course, equally protect itself against capriciousness and spite and the machinations of the kind of mentality that tries to buy influence by subscriptions. It has always been our custom, in the fraternity of the Inner Light, to insist that any woman who proposes to give a large donation should consult her financial advisor before doing so. For one reason or another we have refused upwards of £25,000 during the last 7 years. Nor have we had any reason at regret having done so. The strength of an occult organization does not lie upon the physical plane. It is well known that there are various drugs which can be used to exalt consciousness and induce a temporary psychism. It may not be equally well known that most of these substances come under the regulations of the Dangerous Drugs Act, and that to obtain them from irregular sources, or even to be found in possession of them save for a legitimate purpose, is to render oneself liable to prosecution, and in this case too the authorities are exceedingly alert. All initiates of the right-hand path agree in declaring that to exalt consciousness by means of drugs is a dangerous and undesirable proceeding. There may be research workers who for legitimate reasons wish to undertake experiments, but I cannot conceive of any legitimate reason for introducing a neophyte to the drug habit. In any case, if such experiments are undertaken, they should be conducted under the supervision of a qualified medical practitioner who will be in a position to prevent catastrophe or deal with it should it arise. The drugs that alter consciousness also affect the heart, and hearts are not always all they should be. Moreover, the composition of rare drugs is not standardized and varies enormously. They are liable to contain various impurities, and samples may turn out to be unusually toxic. The unpleasantness of having upon one's hands an unexpected and unaccountable corpse is only exceeded by the unpleasantness of becoming the corpse oneself. Either of which eventualities may happen when people begin to experiment with the drugs that unloose the girders of the mind. The morals of mankind in general leave much to be desired from the point of view of the purist, and the occult organizations, occupying as they do, the seacoast of Bohemia, leave more than usual. A few of the best, maintaining that occultism is essentially a religion, uphold a high standard, the remainder are blessed with a kaleidoscopic collection of soulmates. This need not concern us here. If people choose to kick over Mrs. Grundy's apron strings, that is their affair. Nor need we at the moment consider the occult abuses of sex force, which will require detailed consideration in their proper place. All we need consider in this chapter is the purely normal form of loose living which is camouflaged under a pretense of occultism. Of this I have seen numerous cases. The head of one group systematically seduced his pupils under the pretext that it was part of their initiation, and the group accepted the situation in a spirit of the purest self-sacrifice. Several others sailed unpleasantly near the wind, with the result that crushes and the subsequent nervous breakdowns were very prevalent. It ought hardly to be necessary to say that such methods form no part of the right-hand path. It is amazing to what an extent women of the highest ideals and of good family and wide culture can be induced to accept such theories and practices. The danger of membership of such a group to young girls or unsophisticated women can readily be imagined. I have often been accused of being narrow-minded in my attitude towards groups in which such happenings are allowed to go on. But the cost in human suffering is so great and the general demoralization so sordid that tolerance comes perilously near to cynicism. It may not generally be realized, but there is just as much danger of corruption in a black lodge for boys and youths as there is for women. There have been a number of cases so flagrant that the police have intervened, both here and abroad. In ancient times, and among primitive peoples, human sacrifice was a common incident in connection with occult practices. It is not unknown in Eastern Europe even at the present day. The nursery story of Bluebeard has its origin in the practices of the infamous Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France and comrade of Joan of Arc, who slaughtered innumerable children and youths in connection with his magical experiments. I have never heard of a case in England, but there have been at various times some curious killings reported from the United States which look suspiciously like ritual murders. But in the absence of adequate information it is impossible to come to a final conclusion upon them. There recently came into my hands, however, a book upon magic published for private circulation, in which the statement is made that the ideal blood sacrifice is a male child. The charge of revolutionary activities is one that has been frequently made against the occult movement. There are certain things, however, which must be borne in mind when assessing the truth of this charge. Firstly, the occult movement is not a homogeneous whole. It is totally unorganized and unregulated, and may best be likened to the state of England before the Norman conquest. Conditions in the various groups and associations vary widely, and what is true of one may not be true of another. There can be no doubt whatsoever that various organizations at various times have been implicated in politics, as witnessed the Theosophical Societies Association with Indian political movements. But we must bear in mind that one generation's revolutionaries are the next generation's reactionaries. After all, politics are a matter of opinion, and even the people we disagree with may turn out to be right in the end. I, personally, am of the opinion that an occult fraternity is extremely ill-advised to concern itself with politics for reasons which I have stated in another of my books, Sane Occultism, and which I will not enter upon now, as they are not relevant to these pages. But as folk from time immemorial have banded themselves together for political action, we cannot very well take exception to what the law permits. People who join an organization established for political work join it with their eyes open and presumably for the purposes for which it was founded. Grounds for objection arise, however, when an organization is founded for non-political pursuits and subsequently the leaders, without consulting, or even informing their supporters, take up political activities on their own account and use their organization for the purpose, thus involving their followers without their consent in whatever complications may arise, and using money contributed for a specific purpose for ends other than the donors had in view. It may be wondered what use, at the present day, revolutionaries could make of the occult organizations. Within my personal knowledge they have used, or attempted to use them, for the purpose of getting letters to people whose correspondence is being watched. And I myself once received a request to allow a person who had been deported to return to the country under an assumed name and reside in one of our community houses as a member, and was offered some hundreds of pounds for so doing. Needless to say, the correspondence was sent straight to the authorities. The problems which we have considered in this chapter are not peculiar to occult fraternities, but are common to any organization which does not discriminate as to its members. The organizations which advertise must perforce take all comers and sort them out in the light of subsequent experience, and some of these experiences can be very queer indeed. One cannot blame an organization that picks up an occasional black sheep, one only takes exception if it retains an accumulation of them. A lodge of dubious whiteness can be readily recognized by the type of people who belong to it, who may best be described as the seedy adventurer type with a sprinkling of smart society folk who often have a taste for crude flavors in the way of sensation. The really black lodges are as carefully guarded as the high-grade white lodges, and no outsider can gain entrance to them. The serious student of black occultism is out for knowledge and magical experiment, and he is not going to waste his time on a tyro. Those who choose to graduate into a black lodge after serving their apprenticeship in the outer court of a white lodge do so with their eyes open, and experience must be their teacher. One cannot feel that they deserve much sympathy if the experience is a painful one. The person I am out to help is the person who is a victim, not the one who is hoist with his own petard. The man or woman who, rejecting the steady grade of the way of initiation, chooses to go up with rocket had better come down with the stick. Any request for a large sum of money should always be regarded as a danger signal. It is one of the strictest conditions of initiation that occult knowledge may never be sold or used for gain. I know of an occultist who charges £300 for one of the initiations he confers, and he will give it to anyone who has got £300. In my opinion, the person who pays out £300 for such a purpose deserves the kind of initiation he is going to get. It is also a bad sign when an occultist makes free with signs and wonders before the uninitiated. No genuine adept ever does this. The person who reads your past incarnations, describes your aura, rolls up his eyes, twitches, and gives you a message from your master as soon as he is introduced, is a person to be avoided. The more I see of the occult movement, the more I am amazed at the things people can say and do and get away with. The average person is out of his depth when he deals with psychic matters. He usually goes through 3 phases. Firstly, he thinks it is all superstition and fraud. Secondly, his skepticism being breached, he will believe anything. Thirdly, if he ever gets as far as thirdly, he learns discrimination, and distinguishes between the black fraternities, the white fraternities and fatuous fraternities. Chapter 11. The psychic element in mental disturbance. We have seen in a previous chapter that nervous and mental disorders can simulate a psychic attack, especially if the subject is familiar with the terminology of occultism. We must also consider the part played by psychic attack in nervous and mental disorders. But before we can embark upon this section of our studies, we must give a brief explanation of the nature of nervous and mental disturbances and the distinction between them. We will not go into academic considerations, for these pages are not written for the orthodox professional psychologist, who has an abundance of textbooks at his disposal, but for the person whose interest is primarily in occult matters, and who comes to the study of the subject unequipped with the technicalities of psychology and psychophysiology, two sciences of which at least a working knowledge is exceedingly necessary in the pursuit of practical occultism. In the course of an incarnation, the mind is built up on the foundations of the traits of the higher self, or individuality, which is the immortal soul that develops in the course of an evolution. The mind, therefore, is part of the personality, the unit of incarnation, commencing at birth and dissolving at death, its essence being absorbed by the individuality, which evolves thereby. Note for clarification from the editor/arranger of this HTML document: the personality is the ego or external identity in ordinary consciousness of a person, and the individuality is the higher self, HGA, or spiritual component of a person. The mind is essentially the organ of adaptation to the environment, and it is when that adaptation fails that neurotic and hysterical troubles begin. Each living creature is the channel for a current of life force which proceeds from the Logos, the creator of this universe. This current is divided into three main channels represented to us as the three great natural instincts: self-preservation, reproduction, and the social instinct. These are the mainsprings of our lives. The pressure of life itself is behind them, and if they are thwarted beyond their power of compensation, considerable as that is, they are like streams whose channels are blocked, and which in consequence overflow and make a morass of the adjacent land. Emotion is the subjective aspect of an instinct. That is to say, when an instinct is at work, we feel emotion. Every emotion we feel can be referred to one or other of the instincts. Our resentment of a slur upon our dignity has its roots in the instinct of self-preservation. Our love of art has its roots in the instinct of love, beauty, and creative expression, which, upon its lowest arc, is called sex. Each of these instincts has its high spiritual aspect and its elemental physical aspect, and transmutation from one plane to another takes place freely, so that unless we understand the significance of these manifestations we shall be misled. In their understanding is the key to the science of life. If one of these great instincts is so thwarted that all attempts at compensation break down, or if the temperament is so inelastic and unaccommodating that it will not modify its demands, the ego makes a final desperate attempt at adjustment which goes outside the limits within which harmonious relations with the environment can be maintained. Communications with the environment break down, and the mind has, in part at least, quitted the sphere of reality for the sphere of imagination. The sense of fixed values is lost, and things assume a symbolic importance. This breakdown may be partial, relating to certain aspects of the life only, or it may be total. In hysteria, the dammed-up forces of life remain in the channel, but spurt with concentrated force through any sluice that may be open to them. Consequently, instead of the river below the obstruction being a smooth-flowing body of water, it descends in rapids and whirlpools difficult and dangerous to navigate, so that the bark of life makes shipwreck therein. The surrounding country, too, is reduced to a morass, neither land nor water. In other words, the temperament becomes tempestuous and unduly emotional, and the non-emotional factors of the mind, such as judgment and self-control, are demoralized. Such a temperament must of necessity be perpetually in difficulties with life, and periodically the repressed emotions boil over in fits of screaming, crying, and convulsive muscular movements. which act as safety valves and relieve the pressure temporarily. The neurotic differs from the hysteric in certain well-marked ways which need to be carefully borne in mind, as they are very important from the practical standpoint. The troubles of the neurotic start in the same way as those of the hysteric, being due to repressed emotion and failure to adapt to environment. But in his case, the life forces set to work to cut fresh channels for themselves that shall circumvent the obstacle which blocks their path. Consequently, we get what the psychologist calls displacement of emotion. Some comparatively innocuous matter becomes the object of an outpouring of emotion which in no way concerns it, for it has been made a substitute for something else. It is this curious underground tracking of emotion in the mind which causes so much trouble, for the sufferer is not insane, and yet certain sections of his values and reactions to life are perverted. He is an extremely tricky person to deal with because he is given to unexpected and quite irrational loves and hates and fears, and acts accordingly. Similar conditions prevail in the organic insanities. The psychological results are the same, but because the origin is physical, not mental, they are but little amenable to psychotherapy. Certain things can be done to alleviate them, however, even if they are not entirely curable. Therefore let us consider them from both the psychophysical and occult standpoints. The body is the vehicle of the mind. If the vehicle be faulty, the mind cannot express itself accurately, its reactions will be distorted. Orthodox science says that the brain is the organ of the mind, but esoteric science says the brain is the organ of perception of sense impressions and coordination of efferent impulses. It is the telephone exchange of the nervous system. It is only one of the points where mind touches body, the others being the ductless glands of the endocrine system, the pineal, pituitary, thyroid, adrenals, thymus and gonads, to which may be added the solar plexus and sacral plexus. The student of tantric physiology will be very dull if he has not observed that the chakras coincide in their physical location with the endocrine organs. Now the endocrines have for their task the maintenance of the chemical composition of the blood. They pour into it their secretions, called hormones, in certain balanced proportions. If the balance is in any way upset, either by an overplus of one secretion or shortage of another, profound changes in metabolism take place. The whole of the life processes are regulated by the endocrines, and can be speeded up or slowed down in their different aspects as the balance of the endocrines alters. This endocrine balance is known by physiologists to be intimately associated with emotional states, and especially with the alertness or stolidity of the temperament. Psychologists do not sufficiently appreciate the importance of the recent work upon the endocrines, but occultists have a knowledge of this aspect of psychophysiology as part of their traditional teaching. The breathing exercises of the yoga system are based upon this knowledge, and are exceedingly potent, as are all occult practices which are brought through correctly to the physical plane. In fact, we may say that no occult process is really potent, nor can it be said to have completed its circuit, unless it has its point of contact with dense matter, a point which many occultists leave out of their calculations. Occultism, though primarily a mental process, is not a purely mental process. It is both spiritual and material. In the great majority of cases of insanity, organic brain changes cannot be demonstrated, but alienists are more and more coming to recognize that they may look for the Louis of Hecate in the blood. Its chemical composition may depart from normal, whether owing to a change in the hormone balance or to the byproducts of disease. This change in the blood chemistry is immediately followed by a change in the emotional tone. It may become over-emotional or depressed, apathetic or irritable. The ancients described these conditions admirably as the four humors, the sanguine, the bilious, the lymphatic and the choleric. It has been abundantly demonstrated by physiologists that emotional states affect the chemical composition of the blood. It is gradually being realized that these changes are brought about through the mediation of the ductless glands, which may be called the emotional brain, just as the gray matter within the skull may be called the sensory-motor brain. It follows, therefore, that if through some interference with their functioning the glands produce a blood composition corresponding to that produced by them when a particular emotional state is giving it special stimulus, the individual will experience the physical sensations associated with the corresponding emotional state. His mind will proceed to adjust itself to these conditions by accounting for them through the imagination as best it may. So that if there is a state of the blood characteristic of the condition of fear, fear images will arise in the mind. It is upon this basis that the organic insanities produce their characteristic mental states. Whether the emotional state be due to a mental cause or a physical cause, the result is the same for the patient. Organic insanities are distinguished from functional ones solely by their origin. An organic insanity tends to depart further from the normal than a functional nervous disorder, because in the latter a considerable degree of compensation takes place. For the patient can to a great extent pull himself together and keep himself from going to disastrous extremes. This is not the case with an organic insanity, which proceeds to its logical conclusion. It is for this reason that a neurotic, although he may suffer severely, seldom has a complete breakdown unless he is sure of the necessities of life. The self-preservation instinct keeps him on his feet. Having considered the physical and subjective bases of mental disturbances, we are now in a position to assess accurately the part played by the unseen. What happens when a neurotic takes up occultism? We can best answer this question by considering what happens when a normal person takes up occultism. He learns for the first time of the existence of the invisible worlds and begins to think about them. Immediately he does this, he comes into touch with them. At first he may not be able to perceive them consciously. Nevertheless he is feeling them subconsciously and they are affecting him. His life shows this to the close observer in 1,000 ways. There are great forces moving like currents in the unseen and we are drawn into these according to our temperamental affinity for them. The violent personality is drawn into the current of Mars, the emotional, suggestible one into the sphere of Luna. The influences of these spheres play upon them. Now the occultist working under a proper system, knowing that he has got to meet these forces sooner or later, picks them up one by one voluntarily and by means of the appropriate rituals, and synthesizes them within his own nature. He knows too that each aspect has its obverse. The Virgin Mary is reflected in Lilith. The older faiths knew this, but popular Christianity, which has no roots in tradition, has forgotten it. Protestant Christianity threw away its occult aspect at the Reformation. All the pagan pantheons have gross aspects of divinities as well as ethereal ones. We need to search the refuse heap of history for the lost parts of our own tradition if our faith is to be complete, and the most profitable line of search is in the Kabbalah and the Gnostic literature. The literature of the Gnosis has been largely destroyed by systematic persecution, but in the Kabbalah there is still left us a complete system. The Jews, being strictly monotheistic, did not speak of gods, but they recognized a hierarchy of angels and archangels which is the equivalent of the pagan pantheons. It is through these ethereal messengers that the All-Father formed the worlds. Let us consider once more the Kabbalistic doctrine of the Qliphoth, for it has an intimate bearing upon the problem of insanity. The doctrine of the 10 holy Sephiroth, arranged in their correct pattern to form the tree of life, is invaluable in enabling us to conceive the invisible. The first Sephira is concentrated out of the unmanifest, the point within the circle. This emanates the second, which in its turn emanates the third. As soon as one has emanated another, these two are said to be equilibrated, but when emanation is in process, there is a period of unbalanced force. This, as it were, goes off by itself in the cosmos and establishes a sphere of its own, unconnected with the cosmic system. Consequently, each sphere of the cosmos has its counterpart in chaos, in miniature, it is true, but nevertheless potent and functional. Each sphere, in the course of its evolution, builds up an oversoul which is called by different names in different systems. In the Kabbalistic system we call them the archangels, the spirits before the throne. The sphere of the sun is represented by Raphael, the sphere of the moon by Gabriel. The obverse Sephiroth, or Qliphoth, build up in exactly the same way. In the habitations of hell these two are known as the disputers and the obscene ones, whose names sufficiently indicate their characters. The sphere of the sun is also the point of manifestation of the Messiah or Savior upon earth. The Prince of Peace has his obverse in the disputers. Who that has had the vision beautiful does not know the reaction that follows it, and the need of wisdom, self-control and patience to deal with the forces that are released not only in the soul but in the environment. It is for this reason that periods of purgation and discipline precede all revelations. We must keep the vigil before we can sit at the feast. Consciousness, released from the sphere of earth, rises straight upwards to the sphere of the moon. This is the negative, feminine, receptive, psychic sphere. From thence it passes onwards to the sphere of the sun. This is the positive, masculine sphere of the higher consciousness, the vision of the seer as distinguished from the psychic. Upon either hand the path is flanked by the spheres of hermetic wisdom and elemental beauty. These spheres, which have to do with the grades of initiation, need not concern us in the present pages. We shall only have to do with the sphere of the moon, Luna, the mistress of the lunatic. Now Luna was represented by the ancients under diverse forms as Diana, the chaste huntress, symbol of sublimation, and Hecate, patroness of witchcraft and childbirth. We have already noted that the Qliphoth of the sphere of Luna are called the obscene ones. Hence it is that when the unstable soul advances by the path of Saturn that bridges the astral and enters the sphere of Luna, he touches her Hecate aspect and finds himself en rapport with the Gamaliel, the obscene ones, whose chief is Lilith. She who giveth lustful dreams. Need we then wonder that Freud finds the dreams of the neurotic filled with sexual images in their most perverted and debased forms? The rabbis knew their psychology just as well as he does. As has already been noted, the neurotic is very often psychic, and the psychic is very often neurotic. What may we expect to happen to the soul that has taken initiation in a past life, retains subconsciously the psychic development thus conferred, and finds itself incarnated in a neurotic personality in this life? He will come under the dark dominion of the moon, and Lilith will be his mistress. Through the ill-fitting doors of the neurotic temperament the forces of the abyss find ingress. The dissociated complexes of the microcosm are reinforced by the dissociated complexes of the macrocosm, for that is precisely what the Qliphoth are. Occultists and their ignorant admirers, the superstitious, have always held that insanity had to do with demonic possession. Modern medicine disputes this, and declares the various manifestations of the diseased mind to be due entirely to subjective psychological processes. At present these two schools of thought are like two armed camps, drawn up for battle and shaking their weapons at each other. Each is too sure of his own ground to be willing to give the other a hearing. It is my belief that a common ground can be found for the meeting of these two opposing viewpoints. Psychology demonstrates the mechanism of the mind and can explain the mental processes whereby the ideas of the deranged assume their ultimate form. It can show the connection between these ideas and the dreams of the normal mentality. What it cannot explain is the fundamental difference between these subjective states and the normal waking consciousness. It is here that the occultist can tell the psychologist something that it is worth his while to hear, for he can show how these visions can be produced experimentally and at will by means of ceremonial magic. And still more important, the occultist can show him how these visions can be dispersed and the psychic faculties closed down and sealed. This brings us to the practical part of our considerations: how far can the methods of ritual magic be applied to the relief of mental disease? They are undoubtedly palliative, but they will not produce a permanent cure unless the origin of the disturbed mental condition is found and cleared up. Unless this be done, as fast as we disperse the phantoms, they will reform, because the mental state of the patient is invoking them. Under such circumstances, no magic circle can be kept intact. As fast as we break the rapport with the abyss, the patient renews it. But such conditions constitute a vicious circle. The qliphotic forces with which a contact has been established will actively develop it, and will hold on to their victim when attempts are made to dislodge them. In this rationalistic age we are apt to forget that there is such a thing as organized and intelligent evil. If the physical causes of this disturbance have been cleared up, the septic focus eradicated, or the tumor pressing upon the ductless gland excised, and still the mentality does not return to normal, an exorcism will often produce immediate and marked results. In the case of the neurotic, whose trouble is entirely in the sphere of the mind, an exorcism is of enormous value as a preliminary to the appropriate psychotherapeutic treatment because it clears the ground and prevents reinfection. giving the patient a chance to make a fresh start. It is possible for the cleptotic demons to gain so powerful a hypnotic influence over a victim that he is powerless to break it by any effort of his own will, nor can the orthodox type of psychotherapy touch the root of the trouble. The exorcism may have to be repeated 2 or 3 times in the course of the treatment, because the reports may be renewed after they have been broken. But once the patient's complexes have been cleared up, they will not return. In any case, an exorcism produces marked temporary benefit. During the lull the patient gets a chance to pull himself together and the evil influences are undermined. A courageous patient who is cooperating intelligently will seldom have to be exorcised more than 3 times provided material conditions are favorable. I have seen cases cleared by a single exorcism, and remaining well indefinitely so long as the patient obeyed instructions and had nothing whatever to do with the unseen. Neither reading books upon occultism nor associating with people who were interested in such subjects. And I have also seen the abyss re-establish its influence when the patient disobeyed instructions and reawakened the old vibrations. We need to realize that the human consciousness is not a closed vessel, but like the body, has a continual intake and output. The cosmic forces are circulating through it all the time, like seawater through a living sponge. Whatever emotional state may arise within us is reinforced from outside. The subjective self only has the kindling, the cosmos supplies the fuel. Once the fire is started, the cosmic forces of the appropriate type will stoke it. Just as the devout Catholic is inspired by the influences of his patron saint, invoked by prayer, so the neurotic is hag-ridden by his obsessive demon, invoked by the morbid broodings of the dissociated subconsciousness. The occultist maintains that the generalized principle of evil has its intelligent channels, just as the organized principle of good has its ministering spirits. Any observer who considers the phenomena of mental disturbance will find much to support this hypothesis. The question of obsession is an exceedingly important one. The word is used very freely in occult circles, and is held to mean the withdrawal of a soul from its body and its replacement by another soul, but I doubt whether this is a true representation of what happens. It has always appeared to me that in obsession we have not got the actual replacement of one soul by another, but the complete domination of one soul by another. It is a hypnotic domination, and we can explain it in terms of the known psychology of hypnosis, the hypnotist in the case being an astral entity. There is an operation in magic known as assuming the God form, in which the operator identifies himself in imagination with the god and so becomes a channel for its power. It is one of the special modes of Egyptian magic wherein the priest always wore a mask to represent the animal head symbolically attributed to the god he represented. This imaginative identification is a method well known in occultism and is often employed in order to enter into the inner life of a plant or a crystal as a mental exercise. The effects of it are very marked and very peculiar. I am inclined to think that it is this method, combined with hypnosis, which is used by the obsessing entity, which first identifies itself with its victim and then superimposes its own personality upon his, thus obtaining a vehicle of manifestation. I am also of the opinion, however, that it is only in certain abnormal states, whether induced by disease of mind or body, or by some of the more drastic operations of black magic, that this imposition can take place. Part 3. The diagnosis of a psychic attack. Chapter 12. Methods employed in making a psychic attack. Anyone who reads the old books on witchcraft, usually compiled by the professional witch-finders from the confessions of alleged witches extorted under torture, will find that the phenomena described fall into certain broad categories which are so constant in different ages and in different parts of the world that we are left with the impression that there must be some fire behind so much smoke. The state records of witch trials in Scotland, the reports of a priest charged with the task of extirpating witchcraft in northern Italy, the archives of Brittany, the stories of magic in classical literature, and finally, travelers' accounts of the practices of primitive people all over the world, all corroborate each other, agreeing as to the phenomena described, the explanations given by the witches of their methods, and the broad divisions into which the phenomena fall. We must first take account of the use of drugs, of which the black fraternity in all ages have possessed a remarkable knowledge. Potions, unguents and fumigations were used extensively, and among all the weird and wonderful ingredients of which they were composed we now and again find substances which are known to be medicinally potent. The poppy which gives sleep and dreams, hemp which gives visions, datura which produces loss of memory, blighted grains which produce abortion, certain insects which are powerfully aphrodisiac, certain barks which are effectually an aphrodisiac, and in the New World, the buds of a certain cactus and dash. All these and many others play their part in the witch brews. Paracelsus earned fame by turning some of the traditional magical brews to medicinal purposes. The Borgias earned infamy by employing them as subtle poisons which destroyed the mind without necessarily destroying the body. It is related that the Roman philosopher Lucretius was driven insane by a magical draught given him by his wife in order to restore to her his lost affections. There exist old recipes for witch unguents which contain opium and cantharides. It is not difficult to imagine what manner of dreams would come in the sleep thus induced. C.S. Olivier, in his recent book, Analysis of Magic and Witchcraft, gives it as his opinion that attendance at the Sabbat was often achieved by means of drug-induced dreams. Subtle poisons also undoubtedly play a part in the effectiveness of curses, a favorite method being to make a talisman of brass, copper or lead, and fasten it inconspicuously at the bottom of a drinking vessel or cooking pot. What effect the talisman had is conjectural, but there is no doubt at all about the effect of the steady dissolving of small quantities of lead and verdigris in the food. But while all these things were a part, and a considerable part, of the witch cult, they cannot, strictly speaking, be considered a psychic method of attack. And we only refer to them in these pages in order that their effects may be excluded from the diagnosis. There are three factors in a psychic attack, any or all of which may be employed in a given instance. The first of these is telepathic hypnotic suggestion. The second is the reinforcement of the suggestion by the invocation of certain invisible agencies. The third is the employment of some physical substance as a point d'appui, point of contact, or magnetic link. The force employed may be used as direct current, transmitted by the mental concentration of the operator, or it may be reserved in a kind of psychic storage battery, which may be either an artificial elemental or a talisman. In Chapter 2 we have considered in some detail the psychology of suggestion, and need not repeat what has already been said, save to remind the reader that the essence of telepathy consists in the sympathetic induction of vibration. Experimental psychologists are already suspecting that emotion is closely akin to electricity. They have proved conclusively that emotional states alter the electrical conductivity of the body. The occultist believes that emotion is a force of an electrical type, and that in the case of the ordinary man it radiates out from him in all directions, forming a magnetic field. But in the case of the trained occultist it can be concentrated into a beam and directed. Supposing you are able to concentrate your whole attention upon a single feeling, inhibiting all else, you will have achieved a pure emotional state, unadulterated and undiluted. All the life force coming into your soul will therefore flow in this single subdivision of a single channel instead of in the many ramifications of the usual three channels previously referred to. The concentration will be terrific, but it will only be achieved at a terrific price. It is in order to achieve this terrible concentration that the saints of the West and the yogis of the East practice a torturing asceticism. You must sell all that you possess in order to purchase this pearl of great price, and an echo of the method lingers in the fairy tale tradition that the person who finds the lucky stone can only have one wish. Such a concentration is good for one purpose, and one purpose only. We can concentrate on a healing, or on a destruction, but we cannot work at both simultaneously, neither can we readily change over from one to the other. We cannot combine incompatibles within the limits of a single life. That is to say, if we have concentrated on a work of malediction and death in order to achieve an act of revenge, our rage being satiated, we cannot immediately reverse the spin of the soul and reconcentrate upon works of wisdom and redemption. We may liken the soul moving with the tide of evolution to a wheel spinning clockwise, or diasil, and a soul moving against the tide of evolution to a wheel spinning counterclockwise, or widdershins. The position of the axle can be altered so that the wheel revolves at any angle without the direction of its revolution being affected, but the flywheel has to be stopped before the engine can be reversed. And a big flywheel takes a great deal of stopping. Moreover, in order to reverse the flywheel, we have to stop the engine. The normal movement of the soul is diasil, forward with the current of evolution. We need to think many times before we undertake to reverse that spin even momentarily, in order to undertake a work of malediction and death. The old saying, "There is the devil to pay," is a true one. Indeed, it is questionable whether there is such a thing as a momentary reversal of spin. Momentum has to be checked and worked up again before reversal of spin can take place. Very great forces can be developed by this subjective concentration of the mind itself, but even greater forces can be rendered available if we apply the mechanical equivalent of gearing. If, in other words, while this tremendous concentration is being held, we pick up the contacts of the corresponding cosmic force. We use the powers of the human mind as a self-starter, and as soon as its lesser driving wheel is flying round merrily, we throw in the clutch of the main engine. There is a brief period of struggle as the little machine forces over the reluctant levers of the great machine, then the vapor fires and the engine takes up its work. After that it is only a matter of engaging the gears and driving, if you can. So it is with ceremonial magic. Let us consider a concrete case of someone who wants to avail himself of a fighting force. He would have recourse to a ceremony of the planet Mars. He would therefore gather together in his temple all that was appropriate to Mars. He would drape his altar with a scarlet cloth, he would himself wear a scarlet robe. All his magical implements would be of iron and his rod of power would be a naked sword. Upon his altar he would place 5 lights, 5 being the number of Mars. Upon his breast would be the symbol of Mars engraved upon a steel pentagon. On his hand would be a ruby ring. He would burn sulfur and saltpetre in his thurible. Then, according to the work in hand, he would call upon the angelic or demonic aspect of the 5th Sapphira, Gabura, the sphere of Mars. He would invoke either the deity name in Gabura, calling upon the god of battles to hear him, or the archdevil of the 5th infernal habitation. Having performed this mighty invocation, he would then offer himself upon the altar as the channel for the manifestation of the force. There are many formulae extant designed to enable a force to be brought through without the necessity of the magician himself being the channel. In my opinion they are one and all ineffectual. The only possible substitute for the magician himself being a trance medium. It is for this reason that ritual magic so often fails to come off. You cannot make custards without breaking eggs, and if you mean to be a magician you have got to go the whole hog. When it is a question of bringing through the angelic aspect of a force, the matter is on a clear footing. To be the channel of such a force is a great privilege and is an initiation in itself. The operator has simply to eliminate from his nature all incompatibles and maintain his concentration without wavering. The worst that can happen is that he should fail to obtain his results. But when it comes to bringing through the demonic aspect of a sphere, the matter is on an entirely different footing. Very few people care to offer themselves for the manifestation of such a force as Asmodeus. I do not believe that there is any reliable device for invoking the devils without being obsessed by them save the method of Abramelin, which involves 6 months' preparation and is only operated after the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel have been attained. The edge of the abyss is well fenced. It is not possible to fire a GNN and avoid the recoil. Having invoked and concentrated his force, our sorcerer has next to consider his target. He has to get into astral contact with his victim. In order to do this, he must form a rapport, not quite as easy as might be imagined. First he has to find his victim and establish a point of contact in his sphere, and then, working from this base, succeed in piercing his aura. An unfocused force is not very much use. A focus has to be achieved. The usual method is to obtain some object which is impregnated with the intended victim's magnetism, a lock of hair, nail paring, or something habitually worn or handled. Such an object is magnetically connected with its owner, and the sorcerer can work up the trail and thus enter the sphere of his victim and establish a rapport. He then proceeds as does any other practitioner of suggestion who has succeeded in getting his victim into the first stages of hypnosis. By means of the magnetic link he has gained the psychic ear of his victim, who will hear his suggestions subconsciously. It now remains to be seen whether the thought seeds thus planted will strike root or be cast out from the mind. In any case, the victim is rendered disturbed and uneasy. If a magnetic link cannot be obtained, the practitioner of black magic has to fall back upon other devices. One of the most common is that of substitution. Something is chosen and by means of ceremonial is identified with the intended victim. For instance, a small animal may be baptized with the victim's name, and then immolated, usually with torture, the operator meanwhile concentrating upon the personality of the original. The old device of making a wax image and melting it before a fire, or driving nails into a wooden statue, baptized with the name of the victim, are frequently met with in the records of witch trials. The actual driving of the nail has no conceivable effect upon the victim, but it helps the concentration of the operator. The talismanic method in various forms is also employed. A talisman is a symbol representing a certain force, or combination of forces, depicted upon a suitable substance and magnetized by ritual. It can be made from anything which will retain magnetism. Metals, precious stones, or parchment are usually employed. Paper is less effective unless it be enclosed in a metal case. Water and oil can be effectually magnetized but soon lose their potency. A talisman is made by invoking the requisite force, as already described, and then concentrating it upon the prepared object, which is placed ready upon the altar before the evocation begins. A talisman thus made has next to be brought into the magnetic sphere of the victim. It is related that Lady Burton, anxious to convert her free-thinking husband, the famous Sir Richard Burton, the great explorer, used to get her priest to bless little statues of the saints and put them in the pockets of his clothes. A similar device is used by the workers of black occultism. Magnetized objects are placed in the rooms habitually occupied by the victim, or buried in his path, so that he must pass over them frequently. These talismans of evil not only work by their own power, but also serve the sorcerer as a point of concentration for his meditations. Harmful effects are also produced by objects which have been used in black magic and have become impregnated with the forces they were employed in generating. Odds and ends of magical equipment turn up in some queer places. I was present at an auction in a country town when the 12 signs of the zodiac, neatly painted on a blackboard, came up for sale. Various of my friends have picked up magical treasures, such as altar lamps and incense burners that obviously came out of ritual lodges, but the prize of the collection was a magical rod that was put up to auction along with a bundle of fire irons. Large crystals for scrying are frequently seen in antique shops. All such things need carefully demagnetizing before they are brought into one's psychic sphere. I was taking part at one time in a series of psychic experiments which had been going on very well, when, for no apparent reason, things went wrong and there was a considerable upheaval. We did not know at the time, but we learnt later, that the owner of the flat where they were being held had obtained possession of a floor cloth that had been used in ritual magic by an occultist whom only the utmost leniency could call doubtful. The artificial elemental is really the basis of the efficacy of curses. In this case no physical substance is employed, but a portion of the akasha is molded into a definite form and held thus by the will of the operator until, as it were, it sets. Into this mold is poured the concentrated energy of the operator, something of his own self goes into it. This is its soul, and it is like a self-steering torpedo which is set to move in a curve towards a chosen mark. Or the operator, if an expert magician, may deliberately ensoul this thought form with elemental essence, which is the raw, undifferentiated substance of life drawn from one or another of the elemental kingdoms. It is in order to do this that the curse is invoked in the name of some being. The cursor declares, "I curse you by so and so." This is the form of evocation which calls the ensouling essence into the thought form, thus making an artificial elemental which is endowed with an independent life of its own. If we want to know something of the efficacy of curses, we have only to consider the record of the men who were connected with the opening of the famous Tutankhamen tomb. There are many other cases equally well authenticated. One can become exposed to occult unpleasantness either by thwarting or in some other way falling foul of an unscrupulous occultist, or by getting oneself involved with a dubious occult fraternity. In the case of a quarrel with an occultist, in addition to the ordinary human motives for an abuse of power, one has to reckon with the fact that an adept who is not of the whitest nearly always suffers from that unpleasant psychic disease of hypertrophied ego. He will love power for its own sake, and take any defection on the part of an erstwhile follower, or any resistance to his imperious will as a personal insult or even injury. With a trained mind, an angry thought will do damage, and I have known cases of occultists who, out of pure pique, went to extraordinary lengths of spite. One can only hope that they did not really believe in the efficacy of what they did, and were merely playing to the gallery, pour encourager les autres, and ensure loyalty among their supporters. Another thing which is particularly disliked by this type of adept is any attempt on the part of a pupil who has broken with him to make use of what he has been taught. There seem to be no lengths to which a jealous guru will not go in order to smash his cella psychically. In one case which came to my knowledge, a concert singer had treatment for the improvement of her voice from an adept of sorts. She finally decided that she would spend no more money on this enterprise, and told him so at the visit which she had decided should be the last. He concentrated his gaze upon her and told her that if she broke with him, as soon as she went on the concert platform she would see his face in the air in front of her, and her throat would close and she would be unable to utter a sound. And that this horrible experience would occur every time she tried to sing until she returned to him and continued to have treatment, at a guinea a time. This potent hypnotic suggestion proved effective, and her career was at an end until the spell was broken. The following letter contains a very illuminating experience, and is of value, not only for its account of a psychic attack, but also for its description of the manner in which the attack was combated. In the winter of 1921-2 I was told, from the inner planes, we see your initiation into the Order of the Christ. I did not understand very clearly and I waited. In June, 1922, an Oriental, the head of a great religious order, came to see me. I was living in Switzerland. We will call him Z. I expected great things from him and looked on him as a sort of master. Knowing that he had met Abdu'l-Baha, I thought to please him by putting a BS photo on my walls, but when Z entered my room I saw at once that he did not quite like it. We conversed for a while and he asked me several questions. Suddenly he offered me initiation into his order. I was taken aback and did not feel the inner consent. I said I must reflect. Later on an inspiration came to me and I said, "Is your order the Order of the Christ?" He answered, "It is." I told him of my experience, related above, and accepted initiation, but I had the inner conviction that all was not right. I felt no inner response to several incidents during the initiation, and I began to call mentally and earnestly upon the Christ, and kept on doing so until the end of the ceremony. I learned afterwards that he had told one of his disciples that I had accepted initiation but not the master. It would take too long to relate other less important details, so I go on to our second interview, during which he asked me several times to leave the town where I was and to join him in active work. This time I heard the inner voice clearly. It said, "No." Suddenly he said, "Sit in front of me, I will heal you." I was in very bad health at the time. He fixed his eyes on mine with a strong commanding gaze. Mentally I called on the Christ and I felt form all round me a sort of shell. "There," he said, "I have healed you." The inner voice said, "No." Well, he went away and I had a bad time, for I had the feeling that all was not right, though I had no suspicion of evil. Nor have I now. I wrote an account of this interview to a friend, and a letter from her crossed mine. She told me that about the time of my interview with Z, of which she was unaware, she was told to join our spiritual teacher in helping me. She withdrew from the outer planes, and then she realized that strong hypnotic forces were playing upon me in waves. Again and again she had to use all her spiritual power to help me withstand them, but finally, we stood on a rock, bathed in light and free. My letter gave her the key to it, but she replied, "Take care, Z, we'll try again." He realized that he was baffled. He will try on the inner planes next time. Now comes the great experience. A few weeks later, at night, I had a very vivid vision, it seemed, but it was a real experience. I was in the middle of a group of 7 or 8 persons of whom I saw 2 clearly. On my left was a woman entirely veiled in black, but she made a startlingly clear figure for all that. On the right was Z. He said, "Now I will give her the second, the higher initiation." And he seized my right arm with force. But I disengaged myself, and standing straight and calm I said, "I can hear myself now. Before this ceremony proceeds I wish to make a statement. I can allow nothing and no one to come between me and the Christ." There was a howl, a tossing of hands, and everything disappeared. Soon after I tore up my initiation card, put Z out of my mind, and have had no conscious personal experience of him since. But I had introduced him to a young French musician of high social standing, whom he found much to his taste. We will call him F. There is a close friendship between F and me, and at that time he needed some Oriental music for one of his compositions. On the other hand, he might have been extremely useful to Z, towards whom he felt strongly attracted. After my own experience I began to be much alarmed, but felt that I was not big enough to deal with the situation, so I said nothing to F, but prayed that he might be protected from all evil. Shortly afterwards F told me in his letters of various astral experiences. In his dreams he was going through all sorts of disagreeable things, and voices kept saying to him, "Ask Z to help you. He will help you." Then he became conscious of my presence and began calling on the Christ, all this in his dream, and everything vanished. This happened more than once. Only when I met him again did I tell him of my own experience. I must add that a friend with psychic power came to see me at this time and said, "This last week, at night, I have seen you 3 times. You asked me to help you save a young man who was in danger." What did it mean? The above case indicates clearly the deliberate use of mental power by Z. His pretense of spiritual healing being an obvious attempt at hypnosis. My correspondent says definitely that she has never suspected him of deliberate evil. Rather was he acting rightly according to his lights. I maintain, however, that any attempt to dominate others, or in any way to manipulate their minds without their consent, is an unwarrantable intrusion upon their free will and a crime against the integrity of the soul. How can we judge the intimate spiritual needs of another, especially if that other has not elected to confide in us? What right have we to invade his spiritual privacy and thrust our tampering fingers into the wheels of his innermost being? It is so common a practice to send the names of people to healing circles with a request that they should be concentrated upon, without taking the preliminary precaution of asking their permission. That I have heard it announced from the platform of a large spiritualist public meeting that only those cases could be taken up which gave their written consent. Fortunately for all concerned, the proceedings at such healing circles are usually so futile that nobody need mind being concentrated upon by them even if they were attempting murder. The principle, however, remains, and I can only record my opinion once more, as I have already recorded it many times, that such a proceeding is an outrageous breach of good manners and good faith, and contrary to all occult tradition. I think I can honestly say that I have never wished to direct the great currents of destruction upon my fellow occultists, but there are some of them I would like to get face downwards across my knee. Chapter 13. The Motives of Psychic Attack. We have noted in a previous chapter that the simplest way to find out whether the victim of an alleged psychic attack is romancing or not, is to seek for motives, and if they are not discernible, to give imagination the benefit of the doubt. The commonplace motives of greed, lust, revenge and fear of betrayal do not need psychic discernment for their discovery but are perceptible to the naked eye. There are other motives, however, that may be operative in occult circles but which would be passed by unsuspected by the ordinary investigator. The old charm books that have come down to us, mostly via the servants' hall, are replete with recipes for securing the love of the opposite sex. The ancient grimoires supply more elaborate ritual prescriptions, and the reports of witch trials contain frequent indictments of the wise woman who, for a consideration, undertook to direct people's affections towards persons for whom they apparently had no natural predilection. Are such operations to be taken seriously, or should we class them with the anti-fat pills that reduce without dieting? We have already referred to the old love philters. The ancients were well acquainted with the aphrodisiac drugs which excited sexual passion. Nor are the modems altogether ignorant of them, as carefully worded advertisements in certain occult publications reveal. There are firms in France which specialize in the manufacture of chocolates which contain masked doses of these drugs. Publicity was given to their productions recently owing to the death of 2 girls and a man through taking overdoses. There are cocktails in use in this country containing so-called tonic ingredients whose effect is well known. If these are not love philters, what are they? We are not concerned in these pages with methods that belong solely to the physical plane, but these matters call for mention because there are grounds for belief that upon more than one occasion, even in this country, aphrodisiacs have been employed as an adjuvant to occult practices. There was a certain firm which began to advertise extensively and was building up a nice business in what might be called occultist sundries. Among other preparations which they supplied was incense for the operation of Venus. However, the firm came to an untimely end through the intervention of the police, both partners going to jail. But apart from the use of purely material means, it is not difficult to see what uses could be made of mental influence in this direction. I have seen several cases that looked extremely suspicious, but in these matters it is very difficult to get at the facts. The manner of attack is intangible and leaves no trace, and the victim may be unsuspicious and entirely ignorant not only of the psychic side of sex, but also of its physical and subtler emotional aspects. Moreover, those who have suffered most usually talk least. One may occasionally hear of the attempt which was frustrated. The attempt which was successful very rarely comes to light because the victim has just as much motive for concealing it as the aggressor. When we come to purely occult practices, there are 2 ways in which the desired end can be achieved. Psychic pressure may be brought to bear upon the desired person so that he or she shall come under the influence of the operator, or the psychic operation known as congressus subtilis may take place. What exactly is congressus subtilis? We shall have to know a good deal more than we do at present about the occult side of sex before we can answer that question. In the first place, what are the facts, or alleged facts, of the matter? The ancients held very definite beliefs upon the subject, and these beliefs can very often afford us a clue, even if we do not accept the very anthropomorphic explanations by which they are accompanied. It was believed that the archdemon Lilith had a very great deal to do with these matters. According to the Kabbalists, Lilith was the first wife of Adam, who used to visit him in his dreams while he was as yet alone in the Garden of Eden, and the Lord God became so perturbed at these goings-on that he created Eve as a counter-attraction. Witches were the recipients of similar attentions from the devil. Saint Teresa of Avila records that the Godhead itself visited her. The Virgin Mary received the Holy Ghost. Saint Anthony was tempted by apparitions of beautiful female demons. There are many cases on record of whole nunneries being attacked by the devil, who visited their members. George Moore, in his exceedingly interesting study of convent life, Sister Teresa, gives an account of an outbreak of counterparts among the younger nuns, in which they formed liaisons with angelic lovers, who were supposed to be the souls of those who were drowned in the flood. We read in Genesis and in the book of Enoch that the sons of God mated with the daughters of men, and the demonic race was the result. The folklore of every country contains instances of the mating of humans with elementals, usually with disastrous consequences. Classical literature is full of stories of the visits of gods and goddesses to humankind. What shall we say of all such stories? Is there any element in them beyond fairy tale and wish fulfillment? We can readily understand the motive of the nun who, wishing to conceal the identity of her paramour, declares herself to be with child by the devil. We can equally understand the psychology of the rest of the convent that take up the story and see the devil in every corner. Let me cite certain cases which have come within my personal knowledge and see whether in the light of these we can sift fact from fantasy. There came to visit me once a young man who was in love with a married woman. He told me that upon several occasions he had had a very vivid dream of visiting her, and she had simultaneously dreamed of receiving his visit. He was anxious to perfect the technique of this operation, hence the visit to me. I am afraid I was unsympathetic, consequently I did not obtain any further information concerning this curious experiment. An even more curious case came to my knowledge some years ago. A woman told me that in the days of her youth she had been engaged to marry a man to whom she was very deeply attached, and who was murdered while working as a missionary in West Africa. Having lost the only man she felt she could love, she consented to marry a second cousin who had long been in love with her, and who was a semi-invalid. Whenever she had relations with her husband, she always visualized the form of her first lover. She herself was short, dark and petite. Her husband, a blood relation, was similar in type to herself, and a weed into the bargain. But her 3 sons were tall, upstanding blonde men of the Nordic type, bearing a strong resemblance to the dead man. The truth of this story was vouched for to me by a friend of the family. I have no personally 2 alleged changelings. The male had the pointed ears of Pan, and if anyone was ever a son of the devil, he was. The female was a curious and fascinating creature, essentially non-human, and when her child was born it came into the world with no more trouble than a kitten. Both these beings were conceived when their mothers were under the influence of drink, and both of them were characterized by a marked callousness, which in one case developed into deliberate cruelty. Although very peculiar to look at, neither of them was in the least defective, both being, in fact, possessed of considerably more than the average share of brains. Anyone who has any knowledge of the esoteric aspect of sex knows that union is as much etheric as physical. It is this fact which constitutes the real difference between normal union and self-abuse, and explains why the former is vitalizing and harmonizing, and the latter is exhausting and nerve-wracking. May we not conceive it possible for anyone who can project the etheric body, or a being whose densest vehicle is etheric, to play a part in unions under certain conditions? And if we accept the theory of mediumship, or of obsession, which is a pathological form of mediumship, what shall we say concerning the possibility of a union while one or other of the partners is under control? What maimer of soul might come through into incarnation under such conditions? Medieval tradition recognized 2 classes of demons which invade sleep, and called them incubi and succubi. These were held to be responsible for lascivious dreams. Modern psychology discounts their services and looks nearer home. The psychic, however, is of the opinion that there is something in the old belief, and that the lustful imaginings of men's hearts, and women's too, for that matter, do indeed produce artificial elementals according to the method described in a previous chapter, and that these elementals are something more than subjective images, and have an objective etheric existence and play their part in the genesis of certain experiences. For instance, a person may have dreams and fantasies of a lascivious nature, and these may give rise to their characteristic thought forms. These thought forms, now existing independently of the mind that originally conceived them, and being in the aura of that person, give him suggestion just as any other thought forms projected telepathically from the mind of another person might do. We little realize the extent to which we give ourselves telepathic suggestion by means of extruded thought forms. We are, in fact, ensphered by our own atmospheres, emanated by ourselves. I remember being told as a child that if a bird cage were hung immediately under the canopy of an old-fashioned 4-poster bed, the bird would be found dead in the morning, poisoned by the carbonic acid gas exhaled by the sleeper lying below. We little realize the extent to which we are psychically poisoned by our own emanations of unguarded and unpurified thoughts. It is well known that orgasm takes place in dreams, accompanied by appropriate dream pictures. The ancients believed that such an experience was due to the action of demons. Moderns believe it to be due to physical tension. It is not so generally known that there are people, both male and female, who can produce the same reaction at will solely by means of daydreams. May we not ask ourselves whether it cannot also be produced by means of telepathic suggestion, and whether this may not have played a part in the operations of many covens. There is another curious phase of this aspect of the left-hand path, which was brought to my knowledge through a case which came into my hands. A young girl, simple-minded and unsophisticated, living a very isolated life with a widowed mother, went to consult a well-known psychic, whom we will call Mr. X. In the circle in which both Miss Y and Mr. X moved there was another, and prominent figure, whom we will call Mr. Z, who had a reputation for a knowledge of magic. Mr. X told Miss Y that he had read the records of her past lives, and that there was a karmic tie between herself and Mr. Z. And that she could help him in his work by pouring out upon him her love and magnetism. She was instructed to meditate upon Mr. Z every night as she lay in bed, until she fell asleep. This poor girl, lonely and unsuspicious, gave herself up unreservedly to this task. Presently, however, she began to grow uneasy. Her common sense asserted itself, for she found the meditations she was required to perform were having a very disturbing effect upon her, but Mr. X allayed her fears and recalled her to her allegiance by assuring her that he had looked into the future and seen that eventually Mr. Z would marry her. By now she had upon her hands a heartbreaking love affair which was making her very unhappy and unfitting her for work. A number of letters upon the subject were exchanged between Miss Y and Mr. X, which I have seen. I did my best to persuade her to drop the whole affair. Mr. X succeeded in persuading her to go on with it, playing upon her feelings and telling her how terrible would be the plight of Mr. Z if she withdrew her psychic support, and renewing his assurance of a karmic tie which would result in an ultimate marriage if she were faithful. Miss Y, pitifully distressed and bewildered, betook herself to certain of the leaders of the organization to which all three of them belonged. These people seconded my advice that she should discontinue these practices, but persuaded her to surrender the very compromising letters which were in her possession. Having secured these, they declared that the whole transaction was imagination on her part, and instead of turning this choice pair of scoundrels out of their ranks, let them continue to function as usual. This would be a strange enough case if it were an isolated one, but it is not. Another woman came to me about this time in a state bordering on insanity, and told me that she too had been consulting Mr. X, who had told her that she had already received initiation on the inner planes, though she might not be conscious of it, and that her psychic faculties were on the point of opening, a stock remark of his. But if she wanted to make real progress on the path she must cease to live with her husband and he, Mr. X, would put her in touch with her astral soulmate. The consequence of this precious advice was to break up her home and send her out of her mind. One day, walking in the park, she met Mr. Z and declared him to be her astral lover, a statement which Mr. X confirmed, and embellished with the information that Mr. Z was also the master who would initiate her. I tried to persuade her to bring the whole transaction to a summary conclusion and return to her husband, but she replied that she could never do this after the astral experiences she had had. Mr. X re-established his influence over her. She left the address at which I had known her, and I have never heard what became of her. Her condition when I last saw her was deplorable, emaciated, wild-eyed and twitching with convulsive movements. Would anyone believe the story of such a woman? Obviously no one, unless they had seen the letters that I had seen. Nor is this the only case. A fellow worker of mine told me of two precisely similar ones which had come to her knowledge in connection with Mr. X. It is cases such as these which make the honest investigator of occult phenomena thankful that there is upon our statute book a law which enables magistrates to deal effectually with occultists who prostitute their powers. It is so generally known that no initiate may use the occult arts for gain that it is difficult to sympathize with people who pay some advertising occultist his half-crown or half-guinea and then find themselves let in for unpleasantness. What conclusions may we draw from the incidents that I have related, for the facts of which I can vouch from personal knowledge? For women are persuaded to embark upon a meditation process whose aim is to pour out force. The nature of the force that is to be poured out is indicated by the fact that the married women are instructed not to live with their husbands and the unmarried girl is encouraged to fall in love with the man who is made the focus of the operation. This man is the head of a group of people known to be occupied with practical occultism and ceremonial. The conclusion I draw is that an occult experiment was afoot, and that, regardless of the consequences to them, these women were being made use of in order to carry it out, the procurer being the well-known psychic, Mr. X. And the operator the notorious Mr. Z. The same group have to their credit a recurring series of scandals in connection with unnatural vice. If this were merely vice as such it would not come within the purview of these pages, but it appears to be used systematically as a means of obtaining occult power. Those who have any knowledge of the deeper aspects of occultism know that sex force is one of the manifestations of Kundalini, the serpent, fire that according to Tantric philosophy lies coiled at the base of the spine. Or in the terms of Western occultism, the sacral plexus. The control and concentration of the Kundalini force is an important part of the technique of practical occultism. There is a right way of directing it through thought control, the technique of which I have explained in my little book, The Problem of Purity, Writer. But there is also another method, which consists in stimulating this force, and then directing it into abnormal channels where it will not be absorbed, but remain available for magical purposes. It is for this reason that in certain forms of the Black Mass the altar is the naked body of a woman who may either be still living, or have been slain sacrificially. A. E. W. Mason gives an account of such a transaction in his book, The Prisoner in the Opal. Less expert operators, however, cannot control this form of force. As soon as they generate it, it has to go to its logical conclusion. They therefore employ another type of stimulus, not the woman, but the boy or youth. The practice of paiderasty in connection with occultism is very old, and was one of the causes of the degeneration of the Greek mysteries. I have dealt with these subjects in some detail in another book of mine, Sane Occultism. Particulars of the actual cases can be found by reference to the Files of Truth, the journal already referred to. Chapter 14. The Motives of Psychic Attack. 2. It is a matter of general knowledge among occultists that it is not a pleasant thing to fall foul of an occult fraternity of which one has been made a member by means of a ceremonial initiation and to which one is bound by oaths. As we have already seen, the malignant mind of a trained occultist is a nasty weapon, how much more so the group mind formed out of a number of trained minds, especially if concentrated by means of ritual. But in addition to the individual mental force of the members of a fraternity, and in addition to the collective force of its group mind, there is another factor to be reckoned with when a genuine occult organization is concerned in operations of either protection or destruction. Every occult organization depends for its power to initiate upon what are called its contacts, that is to say, upon one or more of its leaders being psychically in touch with certain forces. If, in addition to this, the organization has a long line of tradition behind it, a very potent collection of thought forms will be built up in its atmosphere. Every initiation ceremony contains in some form or other the oath of the mysteries, which binds the candidate neither to reveal the secrets of the mysteries nor to abuse the knowledge they bestow. This oath always contains a penalty clause and an invocation wherein the candidate submits himself to a penalty in the event of a breach of faith, and calls upon some being to exact the penalty. Some of these oaths are most formidable affairs, and they are administered with every circumstance of solemnity that stage management can devise. The way in which the occult fraternities have succeeded in preserving their secrets shows how seldom these oaths are broken. In the event of a dispute with an occult fraternity, the force invoked in this oath may come into action automatically. If the recalcitrant brother is in the spirit of the tradition and it is his chiefs who are at fault, the power invoked in the oath will be a potent protective influence with which the chiefs themselves will collide. If, on the other hand, he breaks faith with the mysteries, this avenging punitive current will come into action although his defection may pass undiscovered. I was informed by an eyewitness of an incident which took place at an initiation, in which the candidate, a man to all appearances normal in every way, after taking the oath in the usual manner, suddenly screamed most terribly, startling everyone. And was ill for some weeks as if from a severe nervous shock, and never had anything more to do with occultism. No explanation of the incident was ever forthcoming. I was present myself upon one occasion when a batch of 3 candidates was being done, and it was suddenly noticed in the course of the ceremony that the number of the candidates had become reduced to 2. Inquiry elicited the fact that the 3rd had taken fright and fled. What happened in these 2 cases, I do not know, whether there had been a breach of good faith, or whether one was intended, no one can say. But something put the fear of the Lord into these 2 individuals pretty effectually. That no such shock is inherent in the ceremony is proved by the fact that these are the only 2 cases in my experience, and I have seen a very large number of ceremonies. Personally, when I took my own initiation I felt as if I had come into harbor after a stormy voyage. Another man who was intimately known to me as an advanced occultist was turned out of the order to which he belonged. Why, I do not know, but from what I saw of him I should imagine there were plenty of reasons. In defiance of his initiation oath he began to work an independent lodge. He was warned to desist, and did so, dismantling his temple. But he immediately began to get together another temple in a carefully concealed place. And this time he was more ambitious, for he made ready to attempt the greater mysteries. He was an exceedingly clever craftsman and made all the equipment of the temple with his own hands so that no one should know what was afoot. Concealed behind Nottingham lace curtains in a mean street in West London was a beautiful little temple of the greater mysteries. He completed this work after some months of arduous toil, no one knowing of it save those in his immediate confidence. But before commencing the actual ritual work he went away for a short holiday at the seaside, and there he was seized with a heart attack while sitting on the beach and died in 4 hours. The order's secrets were not betrayed. Another man who had had a dispute with the same famous order, printed and published their secrets as an act of revenge. He was a man of good social position, considerable wealth and brilliant literary abilities, already making a name for himself as a writer. From that moment B began to go downhill, and came to poverty and disgrace. The curse of a Hazuerist seemed to be upon him, and he was hounded from country to country, finding no abiding place. No publisher will handle his books, no paper will review them. Let me finally tell of my own experiences in an astral skirmish. I wrote a series of articles on the abuses prevalent in occult fraternities, and these were published in the Occult Review. My writing is largely inspirational, a great deal, coming through of which I have no previous knowledge, and in this particular case I evidently shot a great deal better than I knew, and got myself into serious trouble. My first intimation of it was a sense of uneasiness and restlessness. Next came a feeling as if the barriers between the seen and the unseen were full of rifts and I kept on getting glimpses of the astral mingling with my waking consciousness. This, for me, is unaccustomed, for I am not naturally psychic, and in the technique in which I was trained we are taught to keep the different levels of consciousness strictly separate and to use a specific method for opening and closing the gates. Consequently one seldom gets spontaneous psychism. One's vision resembles the use of a microscope in which one examines prepared material. The general sense of vague uneasiness gradually matured into a definite sense of menace and antagonism, and presently I began to see demon faces in flashes. Resembling those picture images which psychologists call by the unpleasing name of hypnagogics, flashes of dream which appear upon the threshold of sleep. I was quite unsuspicious of any particular individual, though I realized that my articles had probably stirred somebody up pretty thoroughly. What was my surprise, then, to receive from a person whom I looked upon as a friend and for whom I had the greatest respect. A letter which left me in no doubt whatever as to the source of the attack and what I might expect if any more articles were published. I can honestly say that until I received this letter I had not the slightest suspicion that this person was implicated in the scandals I was attacking. I was in a somewhat difficult position. I had fired off a charge of shrapnel on general principles, and had apparently bagged a number of my friends and associates and fluttered the dovecote generally. My position was rather complicated by the fact that I did not know nearly as much as they apparently suspected me of doing. I had, of course, known that these abuses existed sporadically about the occult field, as everybody in the movement knows. But to know in this vague way is one thing, and to put one's finger on specific cases is another. I had evidently blundered into something much more considerable than I had bargained for. I felt like the small boy who, fishing for minnows, has hooked a pike. I had to decide whether I would try and get my articles back from the Occult Review, or whether I would let them run their natural course and take the consequences. I had had a very strong impulse to write those articles, and now I began to see why I had had it. I shall have something to say in another chapter concerning the Watchers, that curious section of the occult hierarchy which is concerned with the welfare of nations. A certain section of their work is apparently concerned with the policing of the astral plane. Very little is actually known about them. One comes across their work sporadically and pieces the bits together. I have crossed their trail on several occasions, as I will tell later. Whenever black magic is afoot, they set to work to put a spoke in its wheels. Be that as it may, I came to the conclusion that, in view of what had now transpired, the impulse I had had to take in hand this piece of work might have emanated from the Watchers. At any rate, the work obviously needed doing. Someone had to tackle these plague spots if they were to be cleared up, so I determined to stick to my guns and see the matter through, and so left the articles in question to run their course. Very soon some curious things began to happen. We became most desperately afflicted with black cats. They were not hallucinatory cats, for our neighbors shared in the affliction, and we exchanged commiserations with the caretaker next door who was engaged in pushing bunches of black cats off doorstep and windowsill with a broom. And declared he had never in his life seen so many, or such dreadful specimens. The whole house was filled with the horrible stench of the brutes. 2 members of our community at that time went out to business every day, and at their offices, in different parts of London, they found the same penetrating reek of the tomcat. At first we attributed this persecution to natural causes, and concluded that we were near neighbors to some fascinating feline female. But incidents succeeded each other which made us feel that things were not quite in the ordinary course of nature. We were getting near to the vernal equinox, which is always a difficult time for occultists. There was a sense of strain and tension in the atmosphere, and we were all feeling decidedly uncomfortable. Coming upstairs after breakfast one morning, I suddenly saw, coming down the stairs towards me, a gigantic tabby cat, twice the size of a tiger. It appeared absolutely solid and tangible. I stared at it petrified for a second, and then it vanished. I instantly realized that it was a simulacrum, or thought, form that was being projected by someone with occult powers. Not that the realization was any too comforting, but it was better than an actual tiger. Feeling decidedly uncomfortable, I asked one of my household to join me, and as we sat in my room meditating we heard the cry of a cat from without. It was answered by another, and another. We looked out of the window, and the street as far as we could see was dotted with black cats and they were wailing and howling in broad daylight as they do on the roofs at night. I rose up, gathered together my paraphernalia, and did an exorcism then and there. At the end we looked out of the window again. There was not a cat in sight, and we never saw them again. The visitation was at an end. Only our normal population of local mousers remained to us. The vernal equinox was now upon us. I must explain that this is the most important season of the year for occultists. Great power tides are flowing on the inner planes, and these are very difficult to handle. If there is going to be astral trouble, it usually blows up for storm at this season. There are also certain meetings which take place on the astral plane, and many occultists attend them out of the body. In order to do this, one has to throw oneself into a trance and then the mind is free to travel. It is usual to get someone who understands these methods of work to watch beside the body while it is vacated to see that it comes to no harm. In the ordinary way, when an occult attack is afoot, one clings to waking consciousness at all costs, sleeping by day and keeping awake and meditating while the sun is below the horizon. As ill luck would have it, however, I was obliged to make one of these astral journeys at this season. My attacker knew this as well as I did. I therefore made my preparations with all the precautions I could think of. Gathered together a carefully chosen group to form the watching circle, and sealed up the place of operation with the usual ceremonial. I had not much faith in this operation under the circumstances, for my attacker was of much higher grade than I was, and could come through any seals I might set. However, it afforded protection against minor unpleasantness. The method of making these astral journeys is highly technical, and I cannot enter upon it here. In the language of psychology, it is autohypnosis by means of a symbol. The symbol acts as a door to the unseen. According to the symbol chosen will be the section of the unseen to which access is obtained. The trained initiate, therefore, does not wander on the astral like an uneasy ghost, but comes and goes by well-known corridors. My enemy's task was therefore not a difficult one, for she knew about the time I must make this journey and the symbol I must use in order to get out of the body. I was therefore prepared for opposition, though I did not know what form it would take. These astral journeys are really lucid dreams in which one retains all one's faculties of choice, willpower and judgment. Mine always begin with a curtain of the symbolic color through whose folds I pass. No sooner was I through the curtain on this occasion than I saw my enemy waiting for me, or, if another terminology is preferred, I began to dream about her. She appeared to me in the full robes of her grade, which were very magnificent and barred my entry, telling me that by virtue of her authority she forbade me to make use of these astral pathways. I replied that I did not admit her right to close the astral paths to me because she was person ally offended, and that I appealed to the inner chiefs, to whom both she and I were responsible. Then ensued a battle of wills in which I experienced the sensation of being whirled through the air and falling from a great height and found myself back in my body. But my body was not where I had left it, but in a heap in the far corner of the room, which looked as if it had been bombed. By means of the well-known phenomenon of repercussion, the astral struggle had apparently communicated itself to the body, which had somersaulted round the room while an agitated group had rescued the furniture from its path. I was somewhat shaken by this experience, which had not been a pleasant one. I recognized that I had had the worst of it and had been effectually ejected from the astral paths. But I also realized that if I accepted this defeat my occult career was at an end. Just as a child who has been thrown by his pony must immediately get up and remount if he is ever to ride again, so I knew that at all costs I must make that astral journey if I were to retain my powers. So I told my group to pull themselves together and reform the circle because we must make another attempt. I invoked the inner chiefs, and went out once more. This time there was a short sharp struggle, and I was through. I had the vision of the inner chiefs, and returned. The fight was over. I have never had any trouble since. But when I took off my clothes in order to go to bed my back felt very sore, and taking a hand glass I examined it in the mirror, and I found that from neck to waist I was scored with scratches as if I had been clawed by a gigantic cat. I told this story to some friends of mine, experienced occultists, who at one time had been closely associated with the person with whom I had had this trouble, and they told me that she was well known for these astral attacks. And that a friend of theirs after a quarrel with her had had an exactly similar experience, and she too had been covered with claw marks. In her case, however, she had been ill for 6 months and had never touched occultism again. There is a curious epilogue to this story, which may or may not have any bearing upon it. I have already told the story of the mysterious death that took place on Lona. How the body of this unfortunate girl was found lying naked on a cross cut out of the turf. No cause of death could be found, and the verdict was that she died of exposure. But if she were lost, how did she come to lie down to die in this ritual manner, instead of wandering about? Why had she taken off all her clothes before leaving her house, covering herself only with a black cloak? And why did she take with her the large knife with which she cut the cross in the turf? I do not know her later history, for I had lost sight of her during the last 2 or 3 years of her life, but at the time I knew her she was associated with the woman I have referred to. The only marks found upon her dead body were scratches. Part 4. Methods of Defense Against Psychic Attack. Chapter 15. Physical Aspect of Psychic Attack and Defense. We have distinguished the various types of psychic attack, we have described the methods that can be employed in carrying them out, and we have also noted the various forms of delusion, fraud and autosuggestion that may complicate the issue. We are now in a position to discuss the question of diagnosis. Let us consider the whole matter from the practical point of view. Supposing a stranger comes with a story of a psychic attack, what should be our procedure? We must first of all bear in mind that there is great need of caution in presuming that a psychic attack is being made. Psychic attacks are comparatively rare things. We must not assume we are dealing with one until we have excluded all the other things it can possibly be. Not so long ago I came across a case of alleged obsession which turned out to be neglected constipation, and which was effectually exorcised with castor oil. If there are any physical symptoms at all, even if they are no more than a bad color or a bad breath, a diagnosis ought to be made by a qualified medical practitioner, for even if the trouble have a predominating psychic element, its origin may be physical. Septic foci are really centers of decomposition, and as such they open the door to low forms of elemental life whose function is to assist in the return of dust to dust. Impurities in the bloodstream may poison the brain. New growths or abscesses may derange its functions. These things can only be recognized by the man who understands the body. Other things being equal, the trained man is the better man, and the man with the best training is the best man, and the only place where an adequate training in diagnosis can be obtained is a general hospital. Moreover, should things turn out badly, the only person who can pull the chestnuts out of the fire is the person whose signature the authorities will accept on a certificate. Supposing the patient turns out to be a lunatic, what is the unqualified practitioner going to do with him? A very large proportion of the cases of alleged psychic attack turn out to be lunatics and hysterics. Incipient lunacy is a very hard thing to detect, hysteria is very cunning and plausible. A doctor who is handling human nature in bulk every day of his life will detect either of these two conditions much quicker than the layman who has never met them before. It may be objected that it is a very difficult thing to find a doctor who will have a sympathetic attitude towards occultism. To argue thus is to misunderstand the position. The doctor is not being asked to cooperate with any occult operation, but to examine for physical disease, and if he finds it, to treat it. He is no more concerned in the occult measures that are taken for the benefit of his patient than he is in the church his patient attends. If the doctor finds no evidence of organic disease, or some complaints such as varicose veins which can obviously have no bearing on the mental condition, the case may be held to have passed the first test. And we may feel that it is worth while to proceed to the psychic investigation. If the case is a bad one, or the trouble is of long standing, the doctor will probably find that the patient is debilitated, even if there is nothing definitely amiss, and will proceed to treat the condition accordingly. This is all to the good, for the better the physical condition of the patient the more mental control and stamina he will have. Sleeping draughts, however, should be avoided if possible, and if they have to be administered, then the patient should be watched while he sleeps by someone who knows how to keep an occult guard. And the room in which he sleeps should be purified and sealed. In the ordinary way, if a person who is out on the astral meets with an occult attack, he bolts back to his body like a rabbit to its burrow and wakes up as if from a nightmare. But if the sleep is made unnaturally deep by a sleeping draught, he cannot wake up, and is locked out on the astral, as it were, which is the last thing one wants in the case of a psychic attack. If a sleeping draught is considered essential, for it is impossible to go without sleep indefinitely, the person who is watching beside the sleeper should observe carefully any signs that the sleep is being disturbed by dreams. And if he observes muttering or twitching, should immediately perform the necessary banishings and whisper into the ear of the sleeper soothing and reassuring suggestions such as Ko recommends should be done in the case of young children. One of the most distressing features of a psychic attack is that the victim fears to sleep because he feels that in sleep he is defenseless. Those who have read Kipling's terrible story, The End of the Passage, may remember that the victim of the occult attack therein described always went to bed wearing spurs in order that he might rowel himself and so wake up if he were struggling with his invisible enemy during sleep. There is a great deal that can be done upon the physical plane to help the person who is suffering from an occult attack. And we may as well consider these physical methods while we are upon the subject of the part that can be played by a doctor in dealing with the case. Sunlight is exceedingly valuable because it strengthens the aura and makes it much more resistant. People are often advised to go away into the country on this account, but for the victim of an occult attack to go into the depths of the country may not be the wisest thing, because elemental forces are much more potent away from towns. And if he is threatened by an uprush of atavistic forces, he had better cling to the haunts of men. The sea, too, is an elemental force that is best avoided, for water is an element intimately associated with psychism. Large bodies of water and high mountains should be avoided in choosing a health resort for a person suffering from psychic trouble. The best place is an inland spa. Games, physical training, massage, anything that improves the bodily condition, are invaluable, but long solitary walks should be avoided because there is often a risk of suicide. The person who is the victim of an occult attack should at all costs avoid solitude. There is another very simple measure which gives immense relief in cases of psychic interference. It is obvious that the attack is made through the psychic centers, therefore anything which closes those centers will render the victim comparatively immune. It is well known how the stolid, materialistic type of person can live with impunity in haunted houses that drive the sensitive to madness and suicide. It is also well known that psychic work cannot be performed if there is food in the stomach. The best results are always obtained when fasting. The obvious corollary of these facts is that if we want to keep the psychic centers closed, we should not allow the stomach to become empty. The person who is facing a psychic attack should not go more than 2 hours without food. Certain important psychic centers are in the head. One of the simplest ways of checking their activity is by drawing the blood down from the head. This can be done effectually by a hot bath or putting the feet in hot mustard and water. Another important center is the solar plexus. During a psychic attack this is often felt to be tense and distressing. A large hot water bottle, well filled so that it is heavy as well as hot, laid upon the solar plexus, which is the handbreadth between the pit of the stomach and the ribs, will effectually relieve tension in that spot. Indeed, pressure without heat will give relief, and I have known cases where a firm pad held in place by a belt or corsets gave much comfort. Above all things, the bowels should be kept freely open while facing a psychic attack, because there is nothing that puts one at so great a disadvantage as the accumulation of effete matter within the body. All these simple physical remedies are readily available. They will not afford a cure for psychic pathologies, nor a complete defense from psychic attack, but they can give great relief from distress. They enable the victim to put up a much more effectual resistance, and by relieving the strain, they increase his endurance. In many cases of psychic attack, he who endures longest wins. Psychic attacks by human beings are not things which can be maintained indefinitely because they use up too much energy. There is an old adage, never use a big spade if a little spade will do. Physical methods of defense involve much less outlay of energy than psychic ones, therefore it is psychically economical to make as much use of them as possible. Why trouble to exorcise the earth elementals with a ritual if you can do it with a pill? The question of diet also requires to be considered in this connection. The widespread propaganda of the Theosophical Society has caused vegetarianism to be regarded as a sine qua non of occult training. This, however, is not the case. The Western esoteric tradition does not make vegetarianism any part of its system, but teaches that a man should partake sparingly and temperately of the food of the land in which he finds himself. Personally, I am inclined to think that occultism and vegetarianism are apt to be an injudicious mixture for a European, the result being a hypersensitiveness that makes life very difficult in our hard-driving civilization. Vegetarianism has to be thoroughly understood and exceedingly well done if it is to be successful, and even so, there is a goodly proportion of people who are incapable of digesting vegetable proteins, which are not nearly so easily dealt with as animal substances. Nothing but experience and experimentation can show whether a vegetarian diet suits a given person. Indigestion is not the only indication that all is not well. Loss of appetite, loss of energy, loss of weight, or a flabby stoutness are all danger signals which if disregarded will cause chronic ill health. Vegetarianism may agree with a person well enough at first, but after a considerable period, possibly years, they may find that they are becoming subject to neuritis, neuralgia, sciatica, or one or another of the nerve pains. This is a sure indication that a vegetarian diet is affording insufficient nourishment, not because it does not contain the necessary food units, but because the digestion is unable to assimilate them and they are passing out of the body unchanged. Wherever there is a history of neuralgic pains complicating a case of psychic disturbance, I should be inclined to suspect chronic malnutrition as the cause of a hypertrophied psychism. In such cases it will probably be found that a gradual return to a nourishing mixed diet will bring about a reduction of the hypersensitiveness, the undesirable contacts that have been formed will fade, and the condition return to normal. The change of diet, however, should always be made gradually lest the digestion be upset. Anyone who is having trouble with psychic disturbance should immediately discontinue all occult practices and should exchange his habitual meditations for the prayers of his childhood, or new thought methods. It is no time to open up the psychic centers when there is astral trouble. The thing to do in such cases is to get back onto the physical plane and stop there resolutely. There was a picture in an old number of Punch which to my way of thinking exactly expresses the correct attitude for the person afflicted by psychic trouble. In front of an old-fashioned four-poster bedstead stands a ferocious female armed with a rolling pin, and from under the valance protrudes the head of her spouse, who says, "Ye may whack me, and ye may thwack me, but ye canna break my manly spirit. For I'll no cam, oot." If the victim of an occult attack concentrates on mundane things, he is a heartbreaking proposition for any sorcerer. What is the sorcerer to do if, at the time when he is operating the black art, his victim is at the local cinema roaring at the antics of Charlie Chaplin? There is an old saying that one nail drives out another. If in fear of invisible dangers, take up a sport with an element of risk in it. Chapter 16. Diagnosis of the nature of an attack. Having considered the purely physical factors in a psychic disturbance, we may now come to the consideration of its genuinely psychic factors. We must always bear in mind, however, that because physical disease is found, it does not necessarily eliminate the psychic factor. A physical condition, such as an abnormal state of the blood, may cause a low form of psychism and put its victim in touch with evil astral conditions. Science may call it delirium or hallucination, but the occultist calls it pathological psychism and can do a great deal to relieve it, either by closing down the psychic centers, or by excluding evil psychic influences from the environment of the patient so that the spirits he sees shall be angelic instead of demonic, and cause him happiness instead of distress. The psychic centers forced open by a diseased bloodstream perceive anything that comes within their range of vision. Therefore let us ensure that nothing save what is pleasant shall come near them. We may not be able entirely to keep him off the astral, but at least we can ensure that his wanderings shall be in a safe and pleasant part of the astral. People do not realize the extent to which the wanderings of delirium can be directed and controlled by suggestions whispered into the ear of the sick person. We can companion the sick man in his astral wanderings and make our voice heard among his visions, by our knowledge driving away the evil presences that threaten him and guiding his dreams into the way of peace. At the commencement of our diagnosis we must distinguish between three broad classes of psychic disturbance: those which are a byproduct of physical disease, those which are due to malicious human action, and those which are due to non-human interference. The first type should be readily picked out by the doctor if, as has already been advised, recourse has been had to him as the essential preliminary. Moreover, he will also be effective in eliminating the frauds, for people moving in psychic circles and familiar with their terminology may simulate a psychic attack either in order to borrow money or obtain hospitality, or out of pure love of notoriety, a far commoner motive for human aberrations than is generally realized. Frauds usually either fade away or recover quickly when threatened with a physical overhaul. Those who decide to chance their luck are pretty quickly caught out by the man who has served his time in the outpatient department of a general hospital. The diagnosis which the occultist has to make therefore lies in distinguishing between the attack of an incarnate mind and the attack of a discarnate mind. There are two ways in which he can do this, and he ought to use them both, so that they countercheck each other. He ought to get at least two independent psychics to psychometrize the case, and he himself ought to make his own diagnosis entirely from the case history interpreted in the light of first principles. It is a great mistake to mix the psychic and the scientific. They are apt to neutralize each other. Let one person do the psychism and another the observation, and let proper precautions be taken to prevent the results of the clairvoyant investigation being vitiated by suggestion, or by the thought reading of previously conceived opinions held in the mind of any of the persons concerned. It is therefore a good thing to send off the specimens for psychometrizing at the commencement of an occult investigation, before any opinions have been formed. It is not the simplest matter in the world to take psychometric specimens properly. I have seen a man bring a lock of hair belonging to someone else out of his pocket, where he had carried it about for a couple of days, and hand it over for psychometry. It was of course so thoroughly impregnated with his own emanations as to be useless. A psychometrical specimen should be some object thoroughly impregnated with the vibrations of a person. A garment recently and habitually worn, a lock of hair, a piece of jewelry, all these can be made to serve provided they are properly preserved. Crystalline substances, such as precious stones, hold magnetism better than anything else. Metals are also good, whether precious or otherwise. A pocket knife, for instance, will hold magnetism well. Wood holds it badly, and so do paper, wool, cotton and artificial silk, especially the latter. Silk and linen are good. India rubber is useless. Glass depends for its holding powers upon its form. If it is cut so that it will refract light it can be very good, if it is flat and purely transparent, like a window pane, it is almost useless. Stone is fair. Earthenware poor. An elaborate article is not as good as a simple article. For instance, a marquise ring is not as good as a signet ring. Letters are apt to be misleading because they often contain nearly as much of the magnetism of the recipient as of the writer. Some psychics can work from a photograph, but this method is not, strictly speaking, psychometry, for the mental image evoked by the photograph is used to pick up the corresponding image in the reflecting ether. Great care should be used in taking a psychometric specimen, for it is readily contaminated by the magnetism of anyone who handles it, who is in proximity to it, or who even thinks about it concentratedly. For instance, if while packing up such a specimen for sending off you are brooding over the problem it presents and working out your own theory, the psychometrist may pick up your thought form instead of reading the conditions of the person to whom the object belongs. The materials which are used for packing should also be free from magnetism. I knew of a case wherein the psychic said that a certain trinket belonged either to a nurse or to someone who had to do with hospitals. As a matter of fact, it belonged to neither, but had been packed in surgical cotton wool. When packing up a psychometric specimen, do it as expeditiously and with as little handling as possible. Take a piece of virgin, black or white silk, not colored, large enough to serve as a wrapper. Throw it over the article and bundle it up rapidly, handling it through the silk. In the occult sense, virgin means something that has never been used for any other purpose. For instance, you should not use part of an old dress or a cushion cover. An article which does not lend itself to handling by this method can be picked up with sugar tongs or the points of a pair of scissors and laid on the square of silk in which it is to be wrapped. Pack the wrapped article in a wooden box, being sure that any padding which is used is also virgin. The report of a single psychometrist should not be relied upon. Specimens should be sent to 2 at least. It is also well when sending specimens, and especially when sending a birth hour for a horoscope, not to allow the name to be known lest gossip should be spread about. Astrologers are much too fond of handing round charts and discussing them. I have known some very unfortunate things come about in this way. A horoscope from someone who understands the nature of the work in hand is of great value, for the position of the planets in the heavenly houses not only serves as an aid to diagnosis but is a very important guide to treatment. It is best therefore to explain to the astrologer the nature of the case, and the kind of information that is wanted, so that he can examine the chart accordingly. A horoscope is to an occult therapist what an X-ray photograph is to a doctor. While awaiting these returns, and while his mind is still uninfluenced by them, the occultist should make his own independent diagnosis. In order to do this, he should have at least 2 interviews with his patient. In the first, he should hear the case history, allowing the patient to present the facts in his own way, without guidance or leading questions. Immediately the patient has left, the operator should write out the case history with as much detail as he can recall. It is exceedingly undesirable to take notes in the presence of a patient, because it makes him nervous, for he feels that, in the words of the police court, everything he is saying will be taken down and used as evidence against him. In preparation for the second interview, the occultist should study this record carefully and have its points and sequence clear in his mind. Now is the time to question the patient concerning any discrepancies or hiatuses. This proceeding will reveal the liar, whether deliberate or hysterical, quicker than anything else, for the discrepancies of his second statement will be clearly revealed against the written record of his first. If he is telling the truth, the 2 statements will be in agreement. If he is distorting the facts, he will soon contradict himself. Remember that you are dealing with a person who has something of either the psychic or the neurotic, or very likely both, in his disposition, and that your attitude towards him, and even your unspoken thoughts, will influence him profoundly. If he feels that you are doubting his veracity, he will lose his self-confidence and begin to think that his experiences may, after all, be the fruits of his own imagination. Consequently, he will suppress things which may be all-important from the diagnostic standpoint. It is in this outpouring of relevant and irrelevant detail that you are going to find your clues. There are certain landmarks which you want to look out for in taking this case history, but you do not want to let your patient realize what you are looking for, because if you have won his confidence, he will be very apt to take on your viewpoint, and if he sees you have formed any opinion, he will unconsciously twist incidents so that they fit in with that opinion. Do not allow him to guess the bearing of your questions, and then you will obtain from him an unbiased response. In order to prevent his guessing what you are driving at, do not ask a series of questions elucidating information on a specific point. There will probably be several points on which you want information. Ask questions upon first one and then another of these. For instance, if you suspect that the trouble may be due to the house in which your patient is living, the last thing you want to do is to rouse his suspicions in this respect, lest you should be on a false scent. And even if you should prove to be on the right track, you do not want to disclose the facts to him until you are ready to act, for by increasing his apprehensions you will increase his sufferings. If you suspect that sex plays a part in his trouble, and he guesses the trend of your questionings, he will immediately cover his tracks, and you will find it very difficult to get at the facts at all. Whereas, if his suspicions are not aroused, he will reveal himself to an astute and experienced questioner who approaches him indirectly, without realizing that he has done so. By approaching thus indirectly, you not only get at the real facts of the case, but spare his feelings. In taking a case history, you want to look for correlations between your patient's psychic experiences and the circumstances of his life. Dates and places therefore should be sedulously sought for. When did the trouble start, and where? Having obtained as detailed information as possible on these 2 points, set out to see whether any occult significance is to be found in it. Note the dates carefully, and turn them up in an ephemeris of those years, and observe how the moon stood in relation to them, also the planets. Observe whether they fell on or about the equinoxes or solstices. Note also the days of the week upon which they occurred. If you found that all the crises of the case occurred on Thursdays, or round about the vernal equinox, or at the full moon, you would have a piece of information which was of considerable significance. You would be sure of one thing, at any rate, that you were dealing with a case in which the invisible psychic tides played a part. Information should also be sought concerning the place or places in which the different crises of the trouble took place, and especially the circumstances attending its first onset. It is exceedingly useful if possible to visit the place and sense its atmosphere. A very great deal can also be learnt from visiting the place where the patient is living. Having obtained such geographical information as you can, study it carefully in connection with a large-scale ordnance map. Access to this, and to all relevant information desired, can readily be obtained at any public library. Note whether there are any prehistoric remains in the neighborhood, and if so, how the house bears in relation to them. Observe not only whether it is near any of them, but whether it is in a direct line between any two of them. Look up the history of the district, and see whether it affords any further information. Roman remains are often at the bottom of the trouble, for the legions brought some very queer cults with them in the days of Rome's decadence. Druid remains, too, should be suspect if they are near neighbors. Inquire also concerning any unusual objects in the house, such as images of the deities of primitive cults or savage weapons. It is quite possible that powerful elementals are attached to these. Inquire whether the trouble seems to lift and the patient goes away to another place. If the reply is in the affirmative, it may safely be presumed that local conditions are at the bottom of the trouble. But if the reply is in the negative, it does not necessarily follow that the opposite is the case. It may also be that the trouble does not depend upon the place, but upon some person residing at the place. Never forget that in the great majority of cases that person's harmful influence is due to an unfortunate psychic makeup rather than deliberate abuse of occult knowledge. Be very slow to accept the latter hypothesis, for its occurrence is comparatively rare. And even if the person suspected is known to have occult knowledge and can be proved to be antagonistic to the patient, it does not necessarily follow that the attack is conscious and deliberate. It may be unconscious and reflex. It is quite true that an occultist ought to have sufficient control over his vehicles to prevent them from acting independently of his will and consciousness, but this is not always the case. People are at many different stages of development. There is always a difficult period between the awakening of the higher powers and their full control. Inquiries should also be made concerning the nature of the dreams, and whether the patient is subject to nightmares apart from any question of occult attack. Also whether he has ever had any other psychic experiences, and if so, of what nature. Finally, a careful inquiry should be made concerning the patient's associates, as to whether any of them are psychic or students of the occult. Be very careful, however, not to cast suspicion upon any person unless you have conclusive evidence, and it is essential to do so in order to save the patient. Remember, it is always possible that you may be mistaken. A case was reported in the papers not so long ago of a man who committed suicide because a doctor told him that he had organic heart disease and ought not to marry the girl he was engaged to. At the post-mortem it was found that there was nothing whatever the matter with his heart. Imagine the feelings of the doctor who had given this rash diagnosis. A person already upset by a psychic attack will be in a state to jump at shadows. He must be handled very discreetly. Be very chary of announcing your suspicions until they are conclusively verified. When all is said and done, the main object is a cure, not an explanation. It is of little value to your patient to fix the blame unless the matter can be cleared up. He is considerably worse off if his suspicions are turned toward some person in his environment from whom he cannot escape, than if he be left to attribute his trouble to unidentified psychic influences. Where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise is truer in psychic matters than anywhere else. Never open the eyes of your patient to a danger for which you cannot give him an effectual defense. The surgeon who is about to operate covers his instruments with a cloth so that the patient shall not see them. The wise occultist does the same. Do not forget that the unseen is always suspect to the uninitiated. Having conducted an inquiry along the lines laid down in the previous pages, you should have acquired a considerable amount of material for investigation. Examine it carefully for correlations of cause and effect. Note if any exacerbation of the trouble is regularly associated with any incident, place, or person. Consider also the various type cases that I have given as examples in the previous chapters, and see if you can find any that resemble the case you are investigating. Note the explanations given, and see if they throw any light upon the problem, or suggest lines along which inquiry might be pursued. Working in this way, you ought to be able to arrive at a tentative diagnosis. If this is confirmed by the findings of the psychics to whom you have sent specimens for psychometry, then you may feel confident you are upon the right track and go forward boldly. Remember, however, that although the psychics ought to agree as to the main points of their investigation, you cannot expect any complete agreement as to details. They are inspecting a composite photograph of the patient's entire life, and there is so much to see that no one person is likely to see everything. The things in which they confirm each other may be held to be established, but the things which the one sees and the other does not are not necessarily illusionary. Chapter 17. Methods of Defense I. In writing for the general reader an account of the methods to be used in combating a psychic attack, I am reminded of those excellent manuals upon medicine and surgery which an enlightened Board of Trade insists shall be provided for the captains of ships, together with a cupboard full of remedies, harmless and otherwise. When an emergency arises, the worthy skipper reads through the chapter he believes to bear upon the case in hand and goes to work as best he may. On these occasions the personal factor is a large one. So it is in dealing with psychic trouble. Wide experience is needed for diagnosis, and specially trained faculties and specially developed powers are needed to cope with the conditions that may be found. This book is more in the nature of a manual of first aid than a treatise on treatment. We must also bear in mind that just as the potent drug is effectual in the hands of the expert but dangerous in the hands of the amateur, so do the more potent occult formulae need special equipment for their use. Moreover, a formula that is used indiscriminately by the uninitiated is apt to lose its potency and become useless. The popular expletive which G.B.S. introduced into polite society in his play, Pygmalion, is the worn-out remnant of the once powerful adjuration, by Our Lady. Moreover, no two cases are alike, and the clear-cut, typical case is a rarity in treasure. Common sense, natural aptitude and experience are the exorcist's best equipment. Having made his diagnosis and being ready to proceed to the handling of the case, the exorcist has to achieve three things: he must repair his patient's aura, clear the atmosphere of his environment, and break his contact with the forces that are causing the trouble. These three things are interdependent, and not one of them is first or last. It is next to impossible to get a damaged aura to heal if you do not clear the atmosphere, nor will the atmosphere remain clear for long if you cannot break the contacts. Theoretically, the ideal thing to do is to break the contacts as a start. But unfortunately, in actual practice, these often take a good deal of finding, and a good deal of handling after they have been found. Meanwhile, something has to be done to keep the patient going. The exorcist has got to clear himself a place in which to work. Or if the victim of the attack is defending himself single-handed, he has got to throw up some temporary defenses while he digs himself in. The first thing to do when dealing with an occult attack is to make a temporary clearance of the atmosphere and so gain breathing space in which to reform the shattered ranks. This is more readily achieved by an organized ritual than by unaided willpower. Any act performed with intention becomes a rite. We can take a bath with no more in mind than physical cleanliness, in which case the bath will cleanse our bodies and no more. Or we can take a bath with a view to ritual cleanliness, in which case its efficacy will extend beyond the physical plane. We therefore perform certain physical actions not only as a means of clearing etheric conditions, but also as a means of definitely affecting astral ones through the imagination, a very potent weapon in all magical operations. Physical objects become impregnated with etheric emanations and retain them for considerable periods as a knife will retain a smell of onions and taint everything that is cut with it. These emanations, magnetism as they are called in the terminology of occult science, profoundly affect any sensitive person who is in contact with them. There is something in the old superstition that it is unlucky to place boots on a table. It is equally inadvisable to place outdoor garments on a bed. You do not know whom you have rubbed shoulders with in bus or train, so why give their magnetism a chance to contaminate your sleeping place? Fortunately for all of us, magnetism is a very fugitive force, and although it may be potent when fresh, it soon fades unless it has been deliberately created by means of ritual. The terrible atmosphere that surrounds the victim of an occult attack and permeates all his belongings is not difficult to get rid of, though it will rapidly reform unless the conditions which gave rise to it are cleared up. The most effectual way of getting rid of magnetism is to move to a fresh place, taking nothing of one's old belongings with one. This, however, is a counsel of perfection for most people. Fortunately, there are other devices which enable us to attain our ends nearly as effectually. If it be in any way possible, let the victim of an occult attack move temporarily to another environment, taking with him as few of his belongings as possible, and let him make the move in new clothes. Or in clothes that are just back from the cleaner. Let him, moreover, keep his whereabouts a secret as far as it is convenient for him to do so. There is an old superstition that a witch can be thrown off the trail by crossing running water. It is my opinion that many of these old folk beliefs have a basis in fact, however overlaid by superstition they may have become. I once had a curious experience which gives support to this opinion. I was about to take part in an important piece of occult work to which I knew there would be opposition. A friend who was concerned in the matter asked me to dine with her on the night before the day fixed for the proceeding. We were both conscious of tension in the atmosphere, and she suggested that I should remain the night at her flat instead of returning to my own, informing no one of my whereabouts in order to throw the attack off the trail. The maneuver was not wholly successful, and we had a rather trying night, and I was conscious of a good deal of psychic tension next day. I decided therefore to walk to the appointed place across Hyde Park in order to refresh myself. When part of the way across, I suddenly felt that the tension relaxed, and I was able to go through the work in hand without interference. I told my friend of this experience, and she questioned me as to where I was when it took place. We looked up the spot on a map, and found that I had just crossed the underground conduit which takes the overflow from the Serpentine. I did not know of the old superstition concerning running water, neither did I know of the existence of the conduit. Nevertheless, the sense of relief was sufficiently marked to cause me to mention it when I saw my friend again, and to be able to indicate the spot where it had occurred. We have very little exact knowledge concerning these subtle forces which are the basis of both occult attack and spiritual healing, but we have good reason to believe that in their nature they are closely analogous to electricity. They are not inanimate forces, however, but have in their nature something that is akin to life, though of a low type. It has been my experience that if we work on a blended analogy of electricity and bacteriology, we get pretty near the facts. As near, at any rate, as our present state of knowledge permits. In other words, if we act as if thought possessed the combined qualities of electricity and bacteria, we shall have a sufficiently accurate method of steering by dead reckoning in the absence of certain knowledge and actual sight. If we consider the various methods used in folk magic of all ages and races, we shall observe that they are in agreement with these hypotheses. Running water, we know, has peculiar electrical qualities, as is witnessed by its effect on the divining rod in the hands of a sensitive person. Whatever it may be that affects the diviner is probably the same thing that affects the occult attack. When we recall, moreover, that running water will throw hounds off the scent just as effectually as it will the alleged witch, we may feel that we cannot be accused of gross superstition if we give the old folk tradition a trial and note the results. Water, again, is the vehicle of purification. It is used in the rite of baptism by the Church and in the preparation of the place by the occultist about to perform a ceremony. Strictly speaking, there should be a trace of salt in the water thus employed, and both salt and water are blessed with powerful invocations when the priest is preparing holy water, whether for a baptism or for placing in the holy water stoup for the use of the congregation. As far as the occultist is concerned, salt to him is the emblem of the element of earth. It is also a crystalline substance, and crystalline substances, in their different forms, receive and hold etheric magnetism better than anything else. Water, on the other hand, is the emblem of the psychic sphere. These two realms, between them, contain by far the greatest part of occult evil. It is rare indeed that spiritual wickedness in high places will reach up as far as the airy realms of mind or the fiery realms of spirit. If we want to get into touch with, or operate upon a particular sphere, we use as base a substance appropriate thereto. Consequently, a solution of salt and water makes a better base than either salt or water could do separately because it enables us to cover the whole of the sphere of probable operations in a single act. It may be interesting to note concerning the magical properties of crystalline substances, that crystals are used in wireless apparatus to pick up the subtle vibrations of the ether. Once again we are close upon the trail of our electrobacteriological analogy. It is an excellent plan, when trying to break an undesirable psychic contact, to immerse oneself in a bath of water that has been especially consecrated for the purpose. Redressing in new or at least clean clothing afterwards, and if it be by any means possible, moving into a different room. If this cannot be done, move the bed into a different position, taking care to turn it at a different angle. That is to say, if you have been in the habit of sleeping lying north and south, place your bed so that you will now be lying east and west. The following prayers may be used for the blessing of the salt and water. Pointing the first and second fingers at the salt. I exorcise thee, creature of earth, by the living God, plus, by the holy God, plus, by the omnipotent God, plus, that thou mayest be purified of all evil influences in the name of Adonai, who is Lord of angels and of men. Extending hand over salt. Creature of earth, adore thy Creator. In the name of God the Father Almighty, Maker of heaven and earth, and of Jesus Christ his Son, our Savior, I consecrate thee, plus, to the service of God, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Pointing first and second fingers at the water. I exorcise thee, creature of water, by the living God, plus, by the holy God, plus, by the omnipotent God, plus, that thou mayest be purified from all evil influences in the name of Elohim Sabaoth, who is Lord of angels and of men. Extending hand over water. Creature of water, adore thy Creator. In the name of God the Father Almighty, who decreed a firmament in the midst of the waters, and of Jesus Christ his Son our Savior. I consecrate thee, plus, to the service of God, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Casting the salt into the water. We pray thee, O God, Lord of heaven and earth, and of all that in them is, both visible and invisible, that thou mayest stretch forth the right hand of thy power upon these creatures of the elements and hallow them in thy holy name. Grant that this salt may make for health of body and this water for health of soul, and that there may be banished from the place where they are used every power of adversity and every illusion and artifice of evil. For the sake of Jesus Christ our Savior. Amen. The water thus consecrated may be used as a bath, or for making the sign of cross upon the forehead, or for sprinkling about a place. When thus using it, the following prayer may be employed. In the name which is above every other name, and in the power of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, I exorcise all influences and seeds of evil. I lay upon them the spell of Christ's holy church, that they may be bound fast as with chains and cast into outer darkness, that they trouble not the servants of God. In pointing or making the sign of the cross, plus, the first and second fingers are extended and the third and fourth are bent towards the palm of the hand and the thumb laid upon their nails. When the hand is extended in blessing over the salt and water, it is held flat, fingers together and parallel, and thumb stretched at right angles to the forefinger. If there is sufficient occult force at work to produce physical phenomena, it is very advisable to take precautions to prevent materializations taking place. The physical phenomena are of several types. They may take the form of noises, usually creakings, thuds, or more rarely bell-like notes or wailing sounds. If actual words are heard, auditory hallucinations should be suspected, for in the absence of a medium, spirit messages are given to the inner ear, not to the auditory nerve. Lights may also be seen, usually taking the form of dim balls of luminous mist drifting like soap bubbles. They may be any size from mere points of light to considerable dimensions, some 6 feet or more in diameter. In these spheres of dim luminosity psychics can generally see forms, sometimes human, sometimes from the animal kingdom. Whitish-gray clouds can also sometimes be seen, rising pillar-wise from the floor like smoke. These are usually fixed to one place and do not move about the room as do the spheres of light, such movement as occurs being within themselves, like the eddyings of smoke caught under a tumbler. More rarely a distinctive odor may be noticed, and still more rarely there may be precipitations of powdery substances or slime. Light objects also may be overturned or thrown about the room. There are certain substances which experience has proved to be effectual in preventing the condensation of etheric energy from taking place. Camphor dissolved in vinegar and placed in saucers about the room will cope effectually with low degrees of force, but for higher potencies nitric acid is the best thing to use, a small quantity being poured into a saucer and exposed to the air. It is best to use it well diluted to prevent accidents, for it is not the strength of the acid in the saucer that is efficacious, but its evaporation into the air, and it will evaporate just as well when diluted as when neat. In what manner it works I have not the slightest idea, but its value is well known among psychic experimenters. The methods of occult attack employed in modern Europe are exclusively mental, so far as my experience of them has gone at any rate. That is to say, they work by the mind on the mind, and only affect physical conditions incidentally. In the East and among primitive people, however, other aspects have to be considered, as a much more etheric type of magic is in use under primitive conditions of life and upon virgin soils. For these etheric operations, material substances are required in order that the magnetism attached to them may be made use of. Hair combings, nail parings, cast-off clothes, objects in familiar use, all contain magnetism. Consequently care should be taken to see that such things are effectually disposed of when discarded. Combings and nail parings should be promptly burnt. Cast-off clothing should never be allowed to go out of the possession of the owner till it has had at least 3 days exposure to sun and air in the open. The magnetism will be more effectually dispelled if the garments be laid on the earth, especially freshly turned earth, than if hung on a line. The same applies to furniture. The chair that has been the accustomed seat and, above all things, the bedding, should be thoroughly aired and sunned before they are parted with. The same precautions are useful if any second-hand article has been purchased. The disposal of night soil should also be carefully arranged for and entrusted to reliable servants, abundant disinfectants and deodorants being constantly in use. Precautions should be observed to prevent any native obtaining access to fresh excreta. After the animal heat has gone out of it, its magical value has greatly decreased. A dirty handkerchief, too, is an effectual magnetic link, and so are dressings from a wound. Anything, in fact, that bears traces of any of the byproducts of the body. But apart from any question of psychic attack, there are 2 substances which are especially prized for purposes of magic, and these are seminal fluid and menstrual blood. The former is used in fertility rites and the latter in certain forms of evocation. These substances are exceedingly hard to come by in primitive lands, because the natives, knowing their significance, guard them most scrupulously. But the Mem Sahib has no suspicions, and allows stained garments and bed linen to go into the hands of the Wazherman to be disposed of at his discretion, satisfied so long as the garments themselves return safely at the end of the week. And never thinking to inquire what becomes of the water in which they were washed. There are many parts of the world in which the sale of these magical substances is a profitable sideline of the laundering business. In Europe, menstrual blood and feces are part of the magical substances of the black mass, being made up into patens with wheat flour. A time-honored method of clearing a bad psychic atmosphere out of a house, and one which I have known in my own experience to be effectual, is to strew garlic about the place, leave it overnight and then take it up and burn it. Among country people, an onion is sometimes placed in a vase on the mantelpiece as if it were a hyacinth bulb when unpleasant visitors are expected, and solemnly burnt in the kitchen fire as soon as they have departed. It being believed that the onion tribe have the property of absorbing noxious emanations. It is curious to note in this respect that in one coal mine to my knowledge the miners are forbidden to take onions down into the workings as part of their dinners because the onions absorb the underground gases and become poisonous. My informant told me that he and others had smuggled onions down and learnt from bitter experience the wisdom of this rule. Chapter 18. Methods of Defense 2. There are 2 types of practical psychic work which may be used separately or in combination, the latter method, in my opinion, giving by far the best results, though the exponents of each are apt to decry the other. The method which we will distinguish as the meditative method consists of mediation upon abstract qualities, such as peace, harmony, protection and the love of God. It is the method of the New Thought school, and its value lies in the harmonizing effect it has upon the emotional state and its counteracting of harmful autosuggestions. The other method, which we will call the invocative, consists in the invocation of external potencies and the employment of formal methods for the focusing of their force. This method has many gradations of complexity and an infinite variety of technique. It ranges from the simplest prayer which calls upon Christ with the sign of the cross, to the most elaborate rituals of exorcism performed with bell, book and candle. The essence of the system lies in the attempt to dissect out from the general force of good the particular aspect of energy that is needed, and the use of some symbol to act as the magical vehicle of that force upon the plane of form. This symbol may be a mental picture of the blue robe of Our Lady, it may be the action of making the sign of the cross, it may be the consecrated water sprinkled for token of cleansing. Or it may be some object specially magnetised to act as a talisman. In the invocative method the aim is to concentrate the force, and therefore some symbol of form has to be employed. In the meditative method the aim is to escape beyond the bounds of form into the atmosphere of pure spirit, too exalted for evil to enter. And therefore the use of any form or formula is eschewed as calculated to prevent the soul from rising into this pure air. In my opinion, and with all due respect to the practitioners of this latter method, much better results would be obtained if the invocative method, with its utilization of the efficacy of formula, were used to enable the mind to climb into the pure air of spiritual consciousness where no evil is. It is only those who are highly trained in meditation who can rise on the planes unaided. It is exceedingly difficult to take off from sense consciousness without the use of some kind of psychological device to act as a springboard. There seems to be little object in refusing for purely academic reasons to avail ourselves of a method of proven efficacy. If we realize that the use of forms and symbols is merely a psychological device to enable the mind to get a grip on the intangible, we shall not fall into the error of superstitious observances. A superstition has been defined as the blind use of a form whose significance has been forgotten. On the other hand, we shall be unwise to rely exclusively upon formal or ceremonial methods unless at the same time we use meditative methods in order to purify and harmonize our own consciousness. If we neglect this aspect of our work, we shall reinfect by our own vibrations the magic circle as fast as we have cleared it. It is not much use sealing a circle with the protective names if we allow a panic-stricken imagination to run riot, picturing every conceivable kind of evil and leaving blank spaces for the possibility of inconceivable kinds. Equally, however, we shall find it very much easier to perform the harmonizing meditation if we are working within the protection of a magic circle. To attempt to perform the work of exorcism solely by means of meditation is like raising a weight by the unaided effort of our two hands. The employment of the magical method resembles the use of a lever, or a pulley and block. Our muscles are still the sole source of energy, but by the utilization of mechanical principles we have redoubled their power. Let us, then, in meditation, use symbols to concentrate our attention. We shall find this much easier than meditation in terms of abstract thought. Indeed, in times of stress and crisis, abstract thought may be impossible for us unless we are very experienced in its use. But we shall seldom reach a state when we cannot picture the cross and call upon the name of Christ. Occult attacks may be divided into two types, those which take place by means of thought forms, and those which operate by means of a current of force. But even in the latter case the current of force soon gathers to itself or germinates thought forms congenial to its nature. Therefore in every psychic disturbance the thought form is a factor which has to be considered and dealt with, and which, in fact, forms the readiest means of diagnosis. For it is by the perception of the associated thought forms that the experienced psychic is able to detect the nature of the attack. Thought force is a thing which has no relation to geographical position, but is a matter of pure consciousness and of tuning in to its keynote. We can pick up the forces of dead faiths 1,000 years after the death of their last votary, and upon the opposite side of the globe to that in which they flourished. But thought forms are a different matter. They have position in space, and although they can be moved about with the speed of thought, and can be withdrawn to the subtlest level of the astral and there anchored to an idea and thus prevented from impinging upon the planes of form for all practical purposes. Nevertheless, although they do not occupy space, they can be referred to definite positions in space. They can, for instance, be associated with a particular object, and will follow that object about, remaining within its magnetic field. The immediate magnetic field is anything from 12 to 30 feet. The remote magnetic field from 100 to 300 yards. Powerful holy centers, like Glastonbury or Lourdes, have a bigger magnetic field than this, extending possibly to a couple of miles. They are also interconnected among themselves by lines of force. These things have to be taken into account in practical occult work. When we are confronted by a disturbing influence emanating from a focus of power, such as the site of an old temple, we have got to deal with the remote magnetic field by means of ceremonial. As this is a method that can only be used by a high-grade initiate, we will not consider it here. For all practical purposes in a psychic attack it is the immediate magnetic field that has to be considered. The best method to deal with this is to make a magic circle. A mere banishing by itself is not so effective as a banishing performed within a circle, because the circle will effectually prevent the banished forces from flowing back again. There are various methods of performing this operation, but the principle of all valid ones is the same. The more potent conjurations cannot be given in these pages, because their effective use depends upon the grade of initiation possessed by the person who proposes to use them. And to possess a formula without the grade to which it belongs is as unsatisfactory as possessing a gun without any knowledge of shooting. The formula I will give will be found effectual for all ordinary conditions. Extraordinary conditions can only be dealt with by a person who has had experience. In making the magic circle the operator stands upright facing east. He faces east because the magnetic current on which he proposes to operate runs from east to west. His first procedure must be to steady his own vibrations and purify his aura. In order to do this, he makes the Kabbalistic cross on breast and brow. Touching his forehead he says, "To thee, O God," touching his solar plexus, "be the kingdom," touching his right shoulder, and the power, touching his left shoulder, and the glory, clasping his hands, unto the ages of the ages. Amen. By this formula the operator affirms the power of God as sole creator and supreme law of the universe to which all things must bow, and he establishes this formula magnetically in his aura by the action of making the sign of the cross upon himself. This sign is not an exclusively Christian symbol, and can be used as readily by the Jew as the churchman, for it is the equilimbed cross of nature that is being used, not the Calvary cross, of which the shaft is double the length of the crossbar, and which is the symbol of sacrifice. The equilimbed cross refers to the 4 quarters of the globe and the 4 elements, and the formula associated with it proclaims the dominion of God over these, and thereby occultly formulates his kingdom within the sphere of the operator. The operator next imagines himself to be clasping in his right hand a large, cross-handled sword, such as is depicted in pictures of crusaders. He holds it point upright and says, "In the name of God I take in hand the sword of power for defense against evil and aggression," and imagines himself to be towering up to twice his natural height, a tremendous armed and mailed figure, vibrating with the force of the power of God with which he has been charged by his formulation of the sword of power. He now proceeds to draw the magic circle upon the floor with the point of the sword of power, and he should see in his imagination a line of flame following the point of the sword, consisting of small flames, such as spring up when methylated spirit is spilt and ignited, but of a pale golden color. A little practice should enable this circle of light to be formulated effectually. Keep on going round the circle until it is formulated. The circle should always be drawn diaso, that is to say, from east to south, to west, to north, in the same way that the hands of a clock would move were the clock laid face upwards on the floor. The contrary way is Widdershins, the way in which the witches danced at the Sabbats. The diacal movement affirms the rule of God's law in nature because it is the way of the sun. The Widdershins movement repudiates God's rule over nature by moving against the sun. In resisting an occult attack, the whole formula should be tuned to the keynote of asserting God's dominion over all existence, the aim of the operator being to align himself with cosmic law and cause the power of God to deal with the interference. The circle being formulated, the operator, ceasing to visualize the sword but still visualizing the circle, clasps his hands in prayer, and raising them above his head towards the east, prays. May the mighty Archangel Raphael protect me from all evil approaching from the east. Turning to the south, he repeats the same formula in prayer to Gabriel. Turning to the west, he invokes Michael. Turning to the north, he invokes Uriel. Facing to the east again, and thus completing the circle, he repeats the formula of the Kabbalistic cross. This formulation of the magic circle is especially valuable for protecting the sleeping place, the circle being drawn around the bed. It is not necessary to move about the room, or shift the furniture in order to draw the circle, it will be formulated wherever it is visualized to be. It is necessary to reaffirm this circle each time the tides change. That is to say, a circle made after sundown will hold good till sunrise, and a circle made after sunrise will maintain its potency till sunset. After the circle has been affirmed a number of times in the same place, its influence will persist for a considerable period, but it is advisable to reformulate it morning and evening during the active phase of an attack. Incense burnt within the circle is very helpful, but care has to be exercised in the choice of an incense. Joss sticks of unknown composition should never be used, as they are usually compounded with a view to assisting manifestation. Good quality church incense, such as can be bought at most church furnishers, is safe and satisfactory because it is compounded according to traditional recipes. Cheaper qualities may not fulfill these conditions. In dealing with elementals or non-human entities, the pentagram, or pentalapha, is the best weapon. This is a 5-pointed star drawn in a particular way. Pointing the first and second fingers of the right hand, and folding the others into the palm and touching their tips with the thumb, proceed to draw the pentagram in the air, keeping the elbow stiff and swinging the arm at full length. Start with the right arm across the body, the hand about the level of the left hip, the extended fingers pointing downwards and outwards. Swing it upwards, as if drawing a straight line in the air, until the fingers point straight upwards above the head at arm's length. Now sweep it down again, keeping the elbow stiff, until the hand occupies the corresponding position upon the right side to that from which it started on the left. You have now drawn a gigantic V upside down. Next, swing the hand across the body, on a rising incline, until it is stretched on a level with the left shoulder, pointing to the left. Bring it across the body horizontally until it is in the same position on the right, fingers pointing away from the body. Now swing it downwards across the body till the hand has come back to the point by the left hip whence it started. This is an exceedingly potent sign. The value of the 5-pointed star, the symbol of humanity, is widely known among occultists, but its potency depends upon the manner in which it is drawn. The method I have given is the correct one for banishing. The potency of the sign may be illustrated by an experience of my own in using it, which the skeptical are at liberty to doubt if they wish. I merely mention it for the sake of those who may be interested. I was taking part in some work with an Indian occultist when I became suspicious that all was not as it should be, protested, and was asked to withdraw. I did so, determined to watch proceedings from a distance, and if my suspicions were confirmed, to have an expose. A few days later I was sitting in my room one afternoon chatting with a friend. It was just getting dusk, and we were talking by the light of a gas fire. Suddenly we were both aware simultaneously of a presence in the room and turned spontaneously in the same direction. My friend sensed an antagonistic presence, and I, being more psychic, saw who it was, and had no difficulty in perceiving the form of my Indian associate in an egg-shaped sphere of misty yellow light. I told my friend to quit the room and wait in the hall, and as soon as the door closed behind her, I made use of the pentagram I have described, together with certain names of power that are unsuitable for disclosure in these pages. Immediately the appearance in the corner by the door shattered and vanished, at the same time there was a resounding crack, which my friend heard in the hall. I called to her to return, and as she entered she exclaimed, "Look what has happened to the door," and we found that one of the panels had split clean in two. It was this that had evidently caused the loud crack we had both heard. I offer no explanation of this incident for the good and sufficient reason that I do not know what the explanation may be. I merely state what happened. My readers can explain it as they please. When it is not possible to seal the room, it is a very useful thing to be able to seal the aura. Stand upright and cross yourself, by touching forehead, breast, right shoulder and left shoulder, saying, by the power of the Christ of God within me, whom I serve with all my heart and with all my soul and with all my strength, extend your hands forward as far as you can reach at the level of the solar plexus, fingertips touching. Then sweep them round to the back and touch the fingertips together again behind you, saying, I encompass myself about with the divine circle of his protection, across which no mortal error dares to set its foot. This is an old monkish formula. It is very effectual, but its potency only lasts about 4 hours. There are various other devices which are useful, not only in dealing with psychic attacks, but in any case of undue influence or domination. If you have to interview persons whose influence you find overwhelming, imagine that they are separated from you by a sheet of plate glass. You can see them, and hear them, but their magnetism cannot reach you. Visualize this sheet of glass until it appears to you to be absolutely tangible. If you have to associate with persons who distress you, but are not actually interviewing them, imagine that they are separated from you by a brick wall, and say to yourself, you just aren't there. I can't see you or hear you, and you simply don't exist. When dealing with a person who saps your vitality, interlace your fingers, and lay your folded hands upon your solar plexus, keeping your elbows pressed against your sides. Keep your feet touching each other. You have thus contacted all your own terminals and made of your body a closed circuit. No magnetism will go out from you while you maintain this attitude. Your friend will probably complain of your lack of sympathy, however kindly you may speak. If anyone tries to dominate you by gazing intently into the eyes, do not attempt to return gaze, for this only leads to an exhausting struggle in which you may get the worst of it. But look steadily at the spot just above the base of their nose, between the inner ends of the eyebrows. If you are merely dealing with an ordinary bully, you will immediately have the upper hand. If, however, your antagonist has knowledge of mind power, you may not be able to dominate him, but he certainly will not be able to dominate you, and the result will be a stalemate. Do not attempt to dominate him, merely keep your eye on the spot and wait for him to weary of his attempt to dominate you. You will not have long to wait. By the use of the methods described in the preceding pages, any person of normal courage and mentality, provided he avoids drugs, alcohol and long periods without food, can, if he does not lose his nerve, wear down any ordinary psychic attack. Or in the case of attacks of abnormal potency, can at least ensure himself time to make good his escape and seek help. The sacraments are also a most potent source of spiritual power, and a church where the blessed sacrament is reserved, or which is sufficiently old to have been consecrated before the Reformation, is an effectual sanctuary. Chapter 19. Methods of Defense 3. Psychic trouble not infrequently arises owing to the formation of an undesirable rapport. In order to understand the nature of this problem, we must consider the whole subject of rapport. We have already considered in some detail the question of telepathic suggestion. Rapport might be considered as the passive aspect of that of which telepathic suggestion is the active aspect. It forms, in fact, the basic condition necessary for telepathic suggestion to take place. Two people who are in rapport might be described as astral Siamese twins. Although the physical bodies are independent units, the astral bodies are linked in such a manner that there is free circulation of astral force between them. Just as the circulatory system of the mother is connected through the umbilical cord with the unborn child, and the same blood circulating freely through both. This fact explains many important occult phenomena. It is the real key to marriage, and explains many facts in the relationship of parent and child. It also accounts for some important aspects of the relation of pupil and teacher. But not only is it possible for a rapport to be established between two individuals, but between an individual and a group. This fact plays an important part in all fraternity work. It is also possible to establish rapport between a human being and other kingdoms of nature, with discarnate entities, superhuman beings, and, in fact, with any form of life with which an individual can form a sympathetic understanding. There must be some ground of sympathy as the basis for the formation of a rapport, but once formed, it can be developed almost indefinitely. It is a curious fact that if a rapport is long continued, the persons thus united gradually come to resemble each other. We all know the horsey type of man, also the son of the soil of whom it was expressively remarked, fathers in the pigsty. You'll know him by his hat. When two human beings are in rapport, the less positive of the two tends to lose his own individuality and becomes the pale reflection of the other. It is for this reason that the Western occultist, who values individuality highly, does not take personal pupils in the same way as does the Eastern guru, but prefers to work through ritual with a group because this method is more impersonal. But even so, the individual members of a group will undergo certain changes whereby they are tuned in to the group tone, so that there will be a certain common denominator which they all possess. Who cannot recognize the sign manual of the Christian Scientist, the Theosophist, the Quaker? Any system which has group meditation rapidly puts its mark on its members. In this fact, of course, lies much of the value of association with a worthy group. In it, equally, lies the detriment of association with an unworthy group. Let us consider what happens when a person of ordinary good character becomes associated with a group of degenerate moral tone. He will either find himself in such sharp antagonism to the group mind that he will have no option but to withdraw, or he will rapidly but unconsciously be tuned to the keynote of his new associates. Without his being aware of the fact, his moral sense will have become blunted and he will accept as a matter of course what he would originally have turned from in disgust. Rapport once established, other things beside the general feeling tone can be shared. Actual ideas can be transferred from one mind to another as in telepathy, and in the same way, vital force can be transmitted. It is this fact which is the explanation of certain types of spiritual healing. When etheric vitality is being transmitted, it is necessary that the persons concerned should be within the immediate magnetic field of each other. But when astral force is in question, this is not necessary. Transmission is independent of space. We are not now considering the legitimate use of this force for healing, or for teaching and developing neophytes, so we will not, therefore, consider its modus operandi in detail. Enough has been said to show in what way it works. Let us now proceed to the consideration of the practical methods of breaking such a rapport if for any reason it is desired to discontinue its use. To astral vision the telepathic link appears as a ray of light, a shining cord, or some similar thought form, because it is in this form that it is usually formulated by the person who is making the magnetic link. It sometimes happens, however, if the operator has a high grade of initiation, that instead of connecting the ray direct to the person with whom he desires to be in touch, he will formulate an astral animal at the end of it to which he transfers a modicum of his own consciousness. This animal form is called a watcher. It does not act on its own initiative unless attacked, when it defends itself according to the nature of the species in whose likeness it is made. The use of a watcher is to obtain a record of what is transpiring without the necessity of focusing consciousness thereon. When the psychic substance of the watcher is reabsorbed by the adept, he becomes aware of the content of the watcher's consciousness. The disadvantage of this method lies in the vulnerableness of the watcher to psychic attack, and the fact that its projector is affected if it is injured or disintegrated. In dealing with a thought form, always bear in mind that it is the product of the imagination, and is in no sense self-existent. What the imagination has made the imagination can unmake. If the maker of a thought form has thought it into existence by picturing it imaginatively, you can equally well think it out of existence by picturing it clearly and imagining it bursting into 1,000 fragments, or going up in flames, or dissolving into water and being absorbed by the soil. That which is thought into existence by the imagination can be thought out of existence by the imagination. If what was taken for a thought form resists destruction by this method, it is probably an artificial elemental. Now there are two such elementals, one kind being ensouled by the invocation of elemental essence into a thought form, and the other by the projection of something of the magician's own nature into it. If it is ensouled by elemental essence, the use of the pentagram will serve to banish it, but if it is of the kind that is ensouled by the magician's own force, another method must be used, known as absorption. Now absorption is a very high-grade method, and its successful use depends upon the state of consciousness of the user. Each individual has to decide for himself whether in any given case at a given moment he is in a fit state to attempt it. Unless he can completely steady his own vibrations and arrive at a state of perfect serenity and freedom from all sense of effort, he should not make the attempt. We will, however, describe the method for the benefit of those who care to try it. Harmonizing himself by mediation upon the Christ, the adept, as soon as he is satisfied that his own vibrations are steady, proceeds to call up before his astral vision the image of the form he intends to destroy. He sees it clearly in all its details and seeks to divine its nature, whether it is a vehicle for malice or lust, or vampiric action. These are the three most common, and it can almost certainly be assigned to one or other of these classes. Having discerned the type of the force with which he has to deal, he then proceeds to meditate upon its opposite, concentrating upon purity and selflessness if the force be lust, compassion and love, if it be malice. And upon God as the creator and sustainer of all life if it be vampiric. He continues this meditation until he feels himself suffused with the quality upon which he is meditating. Until he feels himself so imbued with purity and selflessness that lust causes him to feel nothing but pity, malice causes him to feel nothing but compassion, and in regard to vampirism. He is so assured that his life is hid with Christ in God that he would willingly let the vampire finish its meal in peace if he could thereby help it. In fact, the adept who proposes to perform a magical absorption has to reach the point where he has clearly realized the nothingness of the evil he proposes to absorb. And no longer has any feeling towards it but pity for an ignorance that thinks it can gain any good thing for itself in this way. He desires to uplift and educate and free the misguided soul from its bondage. Until he has arrived at the point when he has no other feeling than this towards his persecutor, it is not safe for him to attempt an absorption. Having satisfied himself that he is ready for the attempt, he proceeds to draw the thought form towards him by pulling in the silver cord that connects it with his solar plexus if it be a vampiric thought form. Or by opening his aura to it and enfolding it if it be one of the other two types. He literally sucks it in. This process should be done slowly and gradually, taking some minutes in the doing. If it be done suddenly, the adept may not find it possible to keep his own vibration steady, and then he will indeed be in an unpleasant situation. As the thought form is absorbed, the adept will feel a reaction in his own nature corresponding to the type of the thought form. If it is a lust force, he will feel desire rise within him, if it is a malicious force, he will feel anger. And if it is a vampire, he will feel bloodlust. He must immediately overcome this feeling and revert to his mediation upon the opposite quality, maintaining it until his vibrations are once more fully harmonized. He will then know that the evil force has been neutralized and there is that much less evil in the world. He will immediately feel a great access of vigor and a sense of spiritual power, as if he could say to a mountain, "Be ye cast into the sea," and it would be done. It is this sense of spiritual exaltation and power which tells him that the work has been successfully accomplished. It is, however, advisable to repeat the meditation at intervals for 2 or 3 days in case another thought form is formulated and sent after the first. As for the sender of the thought form, when the absorption takes place he will feel that virtue has gone out of him, and may even be reduced temporarily to a state of semi-collapse. He will soon revive, however, but with his power for evil of this particular type considerably reduced for some time to come. And if he have the possibility of reform in his nature, it may even be that he himself will be permanently freed from this type of evil. The great advantage of this method is that it actually destroys the evil, root and branch. Whereas the mere destruction of a thought form is like cutting off the top of a weed. On the other hand, it can only be done by an advanced occultist keyed up to the highest pitch. If one is disturbed or harassed or has in any degree lost his nerve, one dare not attempt it. If the rapport is perceived as a line of light, a cord, or any similar form, attached to the solar plexus, the forehead, or any other part of the body, the best way of severing the rapport is to forge a magical weapon and cut it. In fact, if a rapport is felt, the first thing to do is to visualize the cord and try to see where it attaches. The solar plexus is the commonest place. Next, formulate the cross-handled sword as already described, and invoke God's blessing upon it. Then visualize a flaming torch, and invoke the power of the Holy Ghost, whose symbol it is. Now with the sword hack through the cord or ray until every shred is severed. Then sear the stump with the consecrated fire of the torch until it shrivels up and falls off from its point of attachment to your body. After such a severing, one must, of course, take the ordinary human precautions to prevent the link being reformed. Refuse to meet the person responsible for its formulation, or to either read or answer letters from him. In fact, cut off physical communications as thoroughly and resolutely as one has cut off astral ones for a period of some months at least. There are occasions, however, when a person is so completely overshadowed and dominated that he cannot perform this operation for himself. The magical operation of substitution can then be performed, if he can find a friend ready to undertake the task. In order to perform this operation, the two friends agree that it shall be done. But the one who is to become the substitute does not tell the original victim when he proposes to undertake the operation, lest that latter should be so completely in the hands of the dominator that he should give the game away involuntarily. Choosing a time at which he is sure his friend is asleep, the substitute concentrates upon him and imagines himself to be standing beside him, and visualizes the cord or ray of the rapport stretching from his friend out into space. If he can visualize its other point of attachment in the dominator, so much the better. He then formulates the sword and the torch as above described, and with these in his hands he imagines himself stepping right through the line of rapport, so as to break it with his body. He must not use either sword or torch for this process, but break it with his own flesh, as it were. Having thus severed it from his friend, he should then go for it with sword and torch with all his strength as it tries to enwrap him, as it assuredly will do, for it resembles nothing so much as the tentacle of an octopus. He should go for it hammer and tongs, making up in zeal what he lacks in knowledge, until it has had enough, and begins to curl up and withdraw. The combat, of course, takes place in the imagination, but if a clear and vivid image is produced it will be effectual. In illustration of this method I may mention a case I once handled by its means. I was asked if I could help a woman who had been a lifelong invalid, but whose case the many doctors she had consulted were neither able to diagnose satisfactorily, nor to help. They all agreed that there was nothing organic the matter with her, and after trying in vain to get her better, they generally united in saying that it was pure hysteria. She suffered from a chronic condition of exhaustion, indigestion, attacks of vomiting, blinding headache and palpitation of the heart. She was, however, not in the least of a neurotic disposition, but a quiet, sensible, intellectual woman, bearing her sufferings with fortitude. I made a psychic diagnosis and came to the following conclusion. That for many past lives she had been upon the path, and that in her last life, a male incarnation, in order to speed up her progress she had traveled in the East, and eventually took initiation into one of the Tibetan orders, which unfortunately turned out to be upon the left-hand path. Here she learnt the Hatha Yoga, which gives control over the functions of the body. In her present life, she retained the powers her training had given her, but not the memory of its technique. Consequently her emotional states affected those automatic systems of nervous control whose functions are normally not under the direction of the mind. Whenever, therefore, she was emotionally disturbed, her subconscious mentation overflowed into the automatic mind and threw certain of the functional systems of the body out of gear. It is my belief that this explanation affords a key to a good many cases of functional disorder. Many people in the course of occult meditative practices obtain control of the automatic mind which controls the functioning of the bodily organs. It may be recalled that the famous scientist, Sir Francis Galton, the founder of the science of eugenics, experimented with mental control of respiration, and having obtained it, found that the automatic function had fallen into abeyance. And he had to spend 3 anxious days breathing by willpower and voluntary attention until the automatic function was re-established. In this particular case, however, there was more than disturbance of function, there was this peculiar and very marked chronic exhaustion. I formed the opinion that a rapport still existed between her and the Thibetan order of which she had been an initiate in her previous life. As is well known to occultists, one returns life after life to the order of which one is an initiate, the rapport being a very strong one. This is one of the reasons why the great mystery schools have no need to make themselves known by advertising, they know their own, and pick them up on the astral plane. But while it is an invaluable thing to be under the aegis of a reputable order, it is an exceedingly unpleasant thing to stand in a similar relationship to a disreputable order. In this particular case it was my opinion that the order to which this lady had belonged in her previous life had sunk to a very low ebb indeed, and its leaders were deliberately drawing upon the vitality of its members. Acting upon this hypothesis, I projected myself astrally in the way I have already described, and visited this lady at night. I perceived that from her solar plexus as she lay asleep there stretched a black, elastic, stringy-looking substance that resembled nothing so much as a stick of Spanish licorice that has been well chewed by a small boy. This went off into space. Upon trying to see its further end I had a brief and far-off vision of a monastery with a Chinese type of roof perched on a crag among vast mountains. I tackled the situation by the simple expedient of passing in my astral body athwart the line of black substance, thus breaking it. It immediately transferred itself to my solar plexus, and for a moment I felt a surge of tempting thoughts urging me to get this woman under my thumb and exploit her to her full financial capacity. I cast these out, and went for the rope of astral licorice in the manner I have described, casting it off and searing the stump, and had the satisfaction of seeing it curl up and disappear into the darkness. I then fell into what I considered a well-earned sleep. I had told this lady nothing of my ideas because I wanted to see whether I could clear up the case by working solely on the occult hypothesis without any admixture of suggestion. Next morning I visited her to see how she was getting on, and found her sitting up in bed eating a hearty breakfast and looking an entirely different woman to the grey-faced, exhausted creature I had seen the day before. Without waiting for any inquiry from me, she said, "I don't know what has been done, but I feel as if something has been broken and I am free." After breakfast she got up, went for a stroll, and met the doctor who was attending her in the street. So great was the change in her appearance that he failed to recognize her until she spoke to him. I told her that in my opinion she ought to have nothing whatever to do with occult studies lest she reform the magnetic link with her old order. And also taught her how to prevent her subconscious mind from giving disruptive suggestions to her bodily systems of functional control. For some years she remained in good health, but later, unfortunately, took up the study of occultism again and relapsed into a condition approximating to her previous one. Having presumably reforged the contacts with the Thibetan Brotherhood which had proved so disastrous to her. Chapter 20. Methods of Defense 4. There are so many stories of the appearance of guardian angels at moments of crisis that even the most skeptical must admit that there is a case to be answered. There is a tradition in Devon that if Drake's drum, which is preserved at Buckland Abbey near Tavistock, is beaten in a time of crisis, Drake himself will return to lead the fleets of England. Newbolt has immortalized this legend in his famous poem. Take my drum to Devon, hang et by the shore. Beat et when your powders run and low. If the dawn sight Devon, I'll quit the port of heaven. And drum them up the channel as we drummed them long ago. The idea of the hero who returns to lead his people, the guardian angel that appears in times of crisis, is sealed deep in the hearts of all nations, and nothing will eradicate it. Innumerable instances were reported by the men returning from the trenches during the war. Let us again refer to the ancient wisdom of the Kabbalah, that storehouse of occult knowledge. We learn here of the good angel and the evil angel of the soul of man who stand behind his right and left shoulder, the one tempting him, and the other inspiring him. Translate the dark angel into terms of modern thought and we have the Freudian subconsciousness. But the Freudians fail to realize that there is also a bright angel who stands behind the right shoulder of every man. This is the mystic superconsciousness or, in other words, the higher self, the holy guardian angel whom a Brahman sought with such ardor and effort. We all know that, when caught off our guard, there comes a dark temptation from the depths of our lower selves, something atavistic stirs, and we think thoughts, or even do deeds, of which we would never have believed ourselves capable. We have heard the voice of the dark angel speaking. Equally in times of dire stress, when we have our backs to the wall and we are fighting for more than our physical lives, another voice makes itself heard, the voice of the bright angel. I have never known this to occur when a man was fighting simply for his physical life. To those who see beyond the veil, death is no great evil. But in times of spiritual crisis, when the very self is being swept away, then it is that the cry of the soul is heard, and something manifests out of the mists of the unseen, manifests in a form that is comprehensible to the one who calls. Whether intense stress induces a temporary expansion of consciousness, a fugitive psychism, or whether a being of its own volition passes through the veil and manifests, I do not know. There are never any details available of these incidents. They take place only in times of dire stress and go as swiftly as they came, leaving no trace except upon the soul. I maintain that even as the lower self can rise up in moments of temptation, so can the higher self descend in moments of spiritual crisis. It is the aim of the mystic to live exclusively in the higher self. It is the aim of the occultist to bring this higher self through into manifestation in brain consciousness. In my flesh shall I see God. Just as surely as the lower self can rise up and betray us to some horrible deed, so can the higher self come to the rescue, terrible as an army with banners. I have already told of the mysterious voice which instructed me how to extricate myself from grave psychic danger. Upon other occasions of stress and strain I have experienced a sudden expansion or shifting of the level of consciousness. The higher self has descended and taken control. From being in the midst of turmoil one is suddenly raised high above it and sees all the circumstances of one's life spread out like a bird's eye view, as one might see the land from a high place. And one knows intuitively the outcome of the matter. All emotional turmoil ceases, and one is like a ship hove to, securely riding out the storm. When this occurs to me, the memory of my past incarnations is always vividly present also. It is this simultaneous wakening of the past which makes me feel that the voice is that of my own higher self, and not of another entity. It is my belief that in times of spiritual crisis the man that has faith in the law of God can rise up and invoke its protection, and a seeming miracle will be performed for his benefit. Yet there can be no breach of natural law. Therefore such a miracle must simply be an example of the working of a law with which we are as yet unfamiliar, just as an eclipse appears to the savage as a miracle, but to the astronomer as a natural phenomenon which he can forecast with accuracy. What is it that induces this change of control in our lives? We are familiar with the fact that the engine of a car has 3 speeds and a reverse. May it not be that our minds are also geared, and that it is a changing of gears which induces psychism? Are there not times when we get into reverse and the ape and tiger within us take charge? Behind the physical plane lies the astral plane, and behind the astral plane lies the mental plane, and behind the mental plane lies the spiritual plane, each plane acting as plane of causation to the one beneath it. And each in turn being controlled from the subtler plane above it. When we change gear, consciousness is shifted from a denser to a subtler plane, and we begin to move among remoter and remoter causes, of which the happenings upon the physical plane are the end results. We manipulate these causes and the results are immediately affected. When we change gear from the physical to the astral, we find ourselves upon the plane of psychic consciousness and the lesser magic. Supposing a psychic combat is taking place between 2 occultists, if one of them is of such a grade that he can change gear again, so that consciousness is lifted from the astral to the mental plane, he will be in the sphere of the greater magic and be in full control of the situation. The other can make no stand against him. But what happens in the case of the rare and mystic soul who can shift consciousness once again and engage the gears of a purely spiritual power? He has outclassed the adept. There are many souls who have this mystical spiritual consciousness although they have no occult knowledge. Between the higher and the lower modes of thought there is a great gulf fixed across which they leap precariously. If in a time of crisis they are able to rise up in faith and enter into this mystical consciousness and be still, they will have the upper air of any occultist who relies upon nothing save the technique of occultism. The question of mystical consciousness is, however, outside the scope of our present inquiry, which is concerned with psychic methods and the traditional technique of the occultist. Different temperaments will employ different methods, and the mystical method does not appeal to everybody. The occultist does not ignore the Christ force, however. He recognizes it as among the hierarchy of supreme forces of the universe, although he may not be prepared to assign to it the exclusive position which it occupies in the heart of the Christian mystic. In the Western tradition it is symbolized by Tifereth, the central Sephira of the 10 holy Sephiroth of the Kabbalistic tree of life. The Christ force is the equilibrating, compensating, healing, redeeming, purifying factor of the universe. It should be invoked in every operation of psychic self-defense where any human element, incarnate or discarnate, is concerned. Where non-human elements, such as elementals, thought forms, or the Qliphoth, have to be dealt with, it is the power of God the Father, as creator of the universe, that is invoked, his supremacy over all the kingdoms of nature, visible and invisible, being affirmed. God the Holy Ghost is the force that is employed in initiations, and it should not be invoked during times of psychic difficulty, as its influence will tend to intensify the condition and render the veil yet thinner. There is a very curious aspect of the occult field concerning which something must be said in the present pages, though not a great deal can be revealed, and, to be frank, I do not know a great deal about it myself. But only such aspects as I have actually come across. I have always heard it called the occult police. Others may know it by different names, but I believe it to be a very real and concrete thing, though its organization is not upon the physical plane, nor, so far as I know, are its mundane activities gathered up into any single pair of hands. I have crossed its trail upon a number of occasions, and played my part in its activities, and I have talked with others who have also been concerned in it, and they have always said as I do, that it is the inner voice and circumstances alone that direct our activities when we cooperate with this mysterious organization. I think myself that it is organized in national units, for people seem to go in and out of jurisdictions, or to be passed on from one to another. In my experience it has no particular political bias, but concerns itself solely with occult methods applied to criminal ends and offenses against society. One or two illustrative cases may help to make the matter clear. Some complications arose at one time over an Indian occultist who was visiting this country in order to found a school. He was deeply involved in the politics of his own country, and there could be no doubt about it that he disliked the English and all their ways very much indeed. I think that I was the only pure-blooded Anglo-Saxon who was in touch with him. As far as I know, he did not concern himself with mundane plain political activities, his idea being to organize a meditation group which should pour the regenerative spiritual force of the East into the group, soul of the British Empire. Which he declared was in a very bad way indeed. I maintained, however, that the group soul was not dying, as he held, but very tired, for it was immediately after the war. Moreover, I could not see how any body who disliked it so very much was going to be able to regenerate it. Nor was I sure that the regeneration was going to be to our taste if we were to get it. This man, whom I will call X, was of an intense spiritual pride, and his root idea was that England must acknowledge the spiritual supremacy of India and take her spiritual inspiration from the East. I was young and inexperienced at the time, but I began to ask myself what manner of spiritual force was going to be poured in through the channel we were constructing. Supposing during the war a group of English occultists had tried to perform a similar service for Germany, what line would they have taken? Would they not have tried to influence the German group mind to give up its militarist ideals and concentrate on the League of Nations? Was it not more than likely that our Indian friend was trying to disabuse us of our imperialistic tendencies? Would it not appear to him, smarting as he was under the race prejudice of the white man, that the world would be a much better place for humanity if the English cultivated their own garden and let other people alone? I got more and more uneasy, and X, being a good psychic, detected my uneasiness, and I was asked to withdraw from the group he was organizing. I felt quite convinced that something sinister was being attempted against the group mind of my race, but I had no means of gauging its extent or potency. This was not the kind of tale one could take to Scotland Yard. Moreover, several of my personal friends believed in the bona fides of X and were taking part in the group he was organizing, and I was very anxious not to involve them in any unpleasantness. In my perplexity I resolved to do nothing upon the physical plane and to invoke the masters upon the inner planes. At this time I was not of a grade which is supposed to have direct access to the masters, but I determined to try and get them telepathically, though I did not know whether those to whom I was trying to telepath were human or non-human. Incarnate in physical bodies or discarnate entities, for at that time I was not very advanced in my occult studies. All I had to hold on to was an abstract idea and the knowledge that in previous difficulties I had been able to get in touch with something on the inner planes which had proved a powerful friend. In telepathing, the usual method of getting in touch is to visualize the person you want to communicate with and call him by name. I had nothing I could visualize and I knew no names. However, I determined to make the attempt as best I might and, metaphorically speaking, I put my head out of the window of this fleshly tabernacle and called for the police. And I got an answer. The inner voice replied to me very clearly and distinctly. You are to go to Colonel Y. I was taken aback at this, for Colonel Y was a rather eminent person to whom I had once been introduced, and the last person in the world one would invite to go mare's nesting. I had no desire to make myself ridiculous by bearding this formidable warrior in his den. My psychological studies had made me familiar with the workings of the subconscious mind and what it can do when dissociated. And I felt that the situation required handling with considerable caution because the results of a misstep might be unpleasant. I therefore replied to the inner voice, I cannot trust you unless you will give me a sign. The reply came through, Colonel Y will be at our next lecture. Tell him then. To this I replied, I know that Colonel Y cannot be at my lecture because his regiment is ordered abroad, and he will have left before it takes place. The answer came back, Colonel Y will be at your next lecture. Very well, I said, that shall be my sign. If Colonel Y is there, I will tell him, and if not, I shall leave the affair to take its course. The day duly arrived when I was to give a public lecture at a certain town. I arrived at the hall in due course, and the first thing I saw was Colonel Y going up the stairs. So I determined to take the bull by the horns, and immediately after the lecture I went straight to him and said, I have got a message for you. I know you have, he replied, for I have been told to expect it. It appears that he was sitting in his quarters one evening with his 2 dogs. They suddenly became disturbed and began to investigate something that wasn't there. He heard a voice saying distinctly to his inner ear that I should come and ask his help and that he was to give it. He was so impressed by this occurrence that he went to a mutual friend and asked her whether I was in trouble of any sort. At his request she wrote to me to inquire how I was faring, but mentioned no names, and I, not realizing the significance of the incident, returned a noncommittal answer. He heard my story and told me to leave the matter in his hands, which I did. This is a queer enough story of coincidence, but the sequel is even queerer. After leaving Colonel Y, I inquired once more of the unseen whether I should take any further steps. The reply came through that for the present I was to do nothing, but that I would be told when further action was to be taken. I learned afterwards that X had left the country a few days after my interview with Colonel Y. Nothing happened for about 5 months, and then one evening when I was sitting over my fire in the dusk I distinctly heard the inner voice telling me that now was the time to make a move in the matter of X, and that I was to go to Mr. Z and tell my story. Now Mr. Z was a very eminent person indeed, whom I knew of as being an advanced occultist, but whom I had never met. I replied to the interior voice that for me to approach Mr. Z was impossible, I should merely be shown the door, and that unless they could open up the way from their end, I did not see how it was to be done. The answer came through very clearly that the way would be made plain. And it was. A couple of days later a visitor was announced, an old friend whom I only saw occasionally, and after the usual greetings and exchange of news, he said, "I should very much like you to meet a friend of mine who I think would be interested in your work. May I take you to see him? His name is Mr. Z." Needless to say, I agreed. When I came to the appointed meeting, I said to Mr. Z, after I had been introduced, "I have got a message for you," thinking I might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. He listened attentively, and when I mentioned the name of the Indian, my friend who was present, exclaimed, "It is a curious thing that you should be moving in this matter at the present moment. X landed in England a couple of days ago." It will be noted that as soon as X left England, I was instructed to hold my hand, and as soon as he returned after an absence of 5 months, I was instructed to commence action again. Unless we are prepared to pull the long arm of coincidence clean out of its socket, we must conclude that some directing intelligence was at work. This is but one among many instances in my experience. Limitations of space forbid me to mention any more. In addition to the occult police, who function solely on the inner planes, there also exist certain groups of occultists who have banded themselves together for the purpose of combating black occultism. I suppose they give themselves different names, but I do not know what these are. I have always heard them referred to generically as the hunting lodges. Upon various occasions I have skirmished on their flanks and looked on at some lively forays. I imagine them to be organized in conjunction with the occult police, and they certainly possess means of obtaining information which point to cooperation from the inner planes. They appear to possess alliances in unexpected quarters and to be able to pull a remarkable number of strings. What psychic weapons they use I do not know, but upon the physical plane they appear to rely largely upon newspaper exposes, and upon keeping undesirables on the move, never allowing them to settle down and organize. Knowing what I do of their methods, I have from time to time recognized their sign manual in various transactions for which decent citizens have every reason to be grateful. I came across them in a manner which serves to illustrate the way in which occultists can call for information they may be in need of, and the fortuitous train of circumstances that will supply it. As a young girl, at the commencement of my interest in occultism, I came in touch with an adept whom I soon realized to be on the left-hand path, and with whom I soon severed my connection. Shortly after I broke with him, I was watching a gymkhana in company with some friends, among them a student of occultism, and we began to discuss matters of mutual interest. Impelled by I know not what impulse to confide in him what I had never told a soul, I told him of my experiences with the adept I have referred to. To my surprise he knew all about him. It seems that my new acquaintance was connected with a group of occultists who had taken for their work the hunting out of black lodges. They had already crossed the trail of my black adept and had compelled him to close down, and he had sworn not to reorganize his order. They had had reason to believe recently that this oath was not being kept and that he had again organized a lodge and was working his rituals, but they did not know where to lay their hands on him. Then here came I, a bit of human flotsam tossed up on a sports field to give them the information they needed at the very moment when they needed it. These things happen too regularly in occultism for one to be able to look upon them as chance. It is my belief that it is possible for anyone who has need of them to get into touch telepathically with this occult police force. The symbol I was taught to use was a black cavalry cross with circle on a scarlet ground. This is pictured in the imagination, and while gazing at it mentally the call is sent out into the unseen, projecting it from the center of the forehead. Various attempts have been made to prove that the occult fraternities are all directed from a single headquarters, said variously to be situated in Germany, Thibet, Mongolia and South America. Personally I do not believe it. I suppose that I have a pretty varied acquaintance with the inner workings of the occult movement, and I have never seen anything whatever that indicated any centralized control, whether for good or for evil. Everything, in fact, points the other way, and indicates that there is no connecting link save that of a common literature, a common idealism, and a set of symbols which, if not common to all sections, are readily translatable by means of well-understood equivalents. The position in the occult field is analogous to that of Protestant Christianity, not Roman Christianity. Occultism has no pope. Nor do I think that Bolshevism ever gained any foothold in the lodges, though I believe it tried. As witness the application to my own fraternity. The average occultist is not interested in politics, his concern is with things invisible. Moreover, the occult fraternities are too incoordinated and scattered to be formidable political weapons even if they were imbued with Bolshevism. It has also been said that the occult fraternities are controlled by the Jews in the interests of Zionism. This is quite untrue. There are very few Jews in the occult movement. It is true, however, that the Kabbalah, the traditional mysticism of the Jewish race, is one of the principal sources of Western occultism. And that any occultist working on that tradition must know at least enough Hebrew to be able to transliterate Hebrew script. The study of the modern mystical Kabbalah is almost exclusively in the hands of Gentiles, and Orthodox Jewish scholars know little or nothing of its literature and nothing whatever of its mystical significance. No one has said harder things of the occult movement than I have, and if I thought that there were any organized system of evil influence, I should not hesitate to say so, for I have the integrity of the movement very much at heart. But I honestly do not believe that there is any generalized organization of the occult movement, whether for good or evil, whatever may be one's conception of good and evil. One can, of course, only speak of that which one has seen, but I think it would have been impossible for me to have been as intimately associated with that movement as I have been and never to have crossed its trail at any point. I have crossed so many trails, and seen, I will not deny it, so much that was evil, but this particular evil I have not seen, and I do not believe it exists outside the imagination of people with bees in their bonnets. The true nexus of the occult movement is devotion to a common ideal, but this ideal is approached by an infinite diversity of paths, as many as the breaths of the sons of men. I am sorry for the hypothetical person who has the task of organizing the occult movement, for occultists of different schools cannot be induced to cooperate. Any technique which differs from that which they are used to is suspect. Any unfamiliar contact is black. The great majority of the heads of schools that I have known have sat each in his own circle of light and damned everybody else. Like the old lady who watched her son march past with the territorials, they exclaim, "They're all out of step except our jock." I had once dreamed of a federation of occult societies with an annual convention, but I soon realized that it was unworkable. If occultists cannot be got to organize to serve their own interests, it is very unlikely that they would ever be got to organize to serve anybody else's. The most prevalent abuses of Western occultism are immorality, drug-taking and the bamboozling of silly women. Its worst faults are credulity, a slipshod scholarship that verges on illiteracy, and a widespread sappiness of intellect. Fortune-telling in all its forms and some very spurious spiritual healing constitute another slur upon what should be holy ground. It is difficult to do justice to ideals which one does not share, but it has always seemed to me that the highly colored humanitarianism with which certain sections of the movement are soaked is not an ornament. By their fruits ye shall know them. Such fruits of this as I have seen have appeared to me to be somewhat overripe. The finest minds in occultism are totally unknown outside their own orders. A very common clause in initiation oaths binds the candidate not to reveal the names of his fellow members. If this oath were broken, the general public would get some surprises. Occultism not being in good repute with the general public, men in public positions cannot afford to have their names associated with it. Their interest is therefore carefully concealed, and they only speak of it to those upon whose sympathy and discretion they can count. Those who know what to look for, however, can pick them out readily. Anyone who is accustomed to the analysis of literary style can detect the regular reader of the Bible. Anyone who knows the occult rituals will detect their flavor in the literary or oratorical style of a man who is habituated to their use. Perhaps at this length of time I may be forgiven if I break the oath of the mysteries that binds to secrecy concerning the names of initiates and suggest that the key to the Bacon-Shakespeare controversy may lie in the fact that Bacon and Shakespeare were members of the same order. Conclusion. In the preceding pages I have endeavored to discharge a difficult task, one that it is almost impossible to discharge satisfactorily. Limitations of space prevent me from explaining my concept step by step and offering proofs thereof. To have done so would have required a library, not a book. I have had to presume in my readers not only an acquaintance with the literature of occultism but, what is much rarer, some experience of its practice. At the same time I have endeavored to offer sufficient explanation as I went along to make my pages comprehensible to those whose acquaintance with the subject is but cursory. This book is not, and cannot be, a satisfactory handbook for the treatment of psychic disorders. All it can do is to point in directions where inquiries might be pursued with advantage. If it serves to direct attention to certain subjects that badly need investigation, it will have fulfilled its purpose. I may be charged with having revived the superstitions of the Middle Ages. To this charge I must plead guilty. But I must put forward as a counterclaim the plea that there could not be so much smoke without some fire. And that the superstitions of the Middle Ages may repay examination in the light of the recent discoveries concerning the psychology of subconsciousness. Whoever is familiar with the literature of psychic research, abnormal psychology, and the baser aspects of that movement which took its rise from the inspiration of Christian Science and spread into 100 uncontrolled cults, cannot fail to be struck by the fact that the old witch-finders were getting exactly the same phenomena as we meet with in all these different movements and fields of thought. It has been said that since we find the stigmata of hysteria liberally distributed among those unhappy beings charged with witchcraft, that the witch cult is explained and disposed of. But we may find that a study of the real motives underlying the witch cult would throw light on hysteria and the allied mental states. It has also been said that history moves in cycles. At the present moment we are seeing a great revival of interest in psychic and occult subjects. We shall not have to look very much further to find that there are also the very promising beginnings of a witch cult in our midst. Let it be remembered that the cases I have quoted in these pages are from the experience of a single person, and I am by no means exceptional in the range of my experience, though I may be less cautious than most in committing myself to paper. If one dip of the bucket reveals so much, what might not be brought up by systematic dredging? Since my treatment of my subject must necessarily be cursory, I should like to direct the attention of my readers to certain books which throw a great deal of light upon the question from various angles. Not only occultists, but psychologists, alienists, and students of psychic matters owe an immense debt of gratitude to the scholarship of the Reverend Montague Summers and the enterprise of Messrs. Rodker for making available exact and complete translations of the principal books upon witchcraft that were written by the men who were actually concerned in stamping out the witch cult and had first-hand knowledge of its nature. In addition to these I would direct my readers' attention to Projection of the Astral Body, by Muldoon and Carrington, which throws a very interesting light upon the manner in which genuine witches attended the Sabbats. I do not mean by these words to imply that Mr. Muldoon is addicted to wizardry, but he certainly possesses the traditional powers, and if he can do these things at the present day, why could not the witches have done them in days past? At any rate, I do not think there is much doubt that the Holy Inquisition would have paid him the compliment of burning him if he had lived during its heyday. 30 Years with the Dead, by Dr. Wickstead, is another book which gives chapter and verse for personal experience instead of citing authorities and theorizing about them. It is the record of an asylum doctor whose wife is a trance medium, and who made a most remarkable series of investigations concerning the nature of obsessing entities. In Dr. Moll's book on hypnotism some remarkable phenomena are recorded such as do not find their way into modern books, whether because the investigators are less expert at eliciting them, or more cautious in communicating them. Having profited by the experience of the earlier investigators. Some of the earlier books on hypnosis and mesmerism yield some very interesting reading to the psychic investigator. Dr. T. W. Mitchell's Medical Psychology and Psychical Research is another book of value to the student, who should be familiar not only with the signs of psychic attack, but also with the signs of pseudo-attack in order that he may distinguish between them and not be misled into some very uncomfortable errors. To find one has been successfully hoaxed by a lunatic is a humiliating experience. Meyer's Human Personality is of course a classic with which every student of psychic phenomena ought to be familiar. There is an excellent abridged edition available for those who do not feel equal to coping with the two massive volumes of its original form. Nichols' Dream Psychology and Hart's Psychology of Insanity are two exceedingly illuminating little books, both written for the layman and readily comprehensible by him. They throw a great deal of light upon the mechanisms of the mind, and no one should attempt to deal with a psychic attack unless he understands those mechanisms. My own little book, Machinery of the Mind, written under my maiden name of Violet M. Firth, will, I think, be found a useful general introduction to modern psychology. Let us approach the subject of modern witchcraft neither in a spirit of incredulity nor of superstition, but from the standpoint of the psychologist, seeking to understand the workings of the mind and prepared to discover much that had hitherto passed unsuspected.